Hello everyone, very good morning and welcome to Byju's Exam Prep. Welcome back to our discussion on international relations. Yesterday we had started with a very important region, that is the Indian Ocean region. It's a very interesting chapter. We understood why the Indian Ocean is important for India. We spoke about the Sagar doctrine of India, and we had started with India's relations with a very important Indian Ocean country, that is Sri Lanka. We had covered the basics, the background. We were talking about the ethnic divide in Sri Lanka, how Sinhala Buddhist majority had targeted the Tamil minorities. We started talking about the rise of Tamil militancy in 1970s and 1980s, and how India played a direct role in allegedly supporting the Tamil militant groups, specifically the LTTE. So by early 1980s, we saw the rise of LTTE. Tamil militancy was scaling up in its violence, and this was met with counterattacks by the Sri Lankan government forces and also by the radical Sinhala Buddhists. This resulted in large-scale violence in Sri Lanka, and the country had descended into a civil war by 1983. It triggered a massive humanitarian crisis, and a large-scale refugee crisis was triggered as a result of the civil war. Tamil refugees started flowing into India in large numbers, and thousands of innocent Tamil civilians were killed in this conflict. So as the crisis escalated, things were going out of control, and LTTE, which had become very strong and powerful by now, was going out of control, and India was not able to keep LTTE under check. As I told you yesterday, India made a blunder in backing and sponsoring such a violent extremist outfit. I explained India's motivation, the reason why India got involved, the reason why India exploited the issue. Because Sri Lanka had turned hostile to India in 1970s, especially after the 1971 war. So the then Indira Gandhi government saw this as an opportunity to weaken Sri Lanka, to exploit Sri Lanka's internal issues. But this strategy was backfiring as LTTE had become a notorious terrorist organization. It was no longer just a militant insurgent group. It had clearly become a terrorist organization as it was engaging in mindless acts of violence. It was targeting civilians as well, not just the government forces and the radical elements. So as LTTE went out of control and became a notorious terrorist outfit, India decided to scale back the support. Because in the year 1984, India had a very bitter experience as a result of covert wars and terrorism. This was related to the Khalistan movement. The Khalistan movement, which was parallelly raging in Punjab, which was supported by Pakistan, by the ISI, was a Pakistani covert war against India. As a result of the Khalistan movement, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her own bodyguards. This is something we'll study in detail under internal security. When I cover Khalistan movement under internal security, they will discuss the events leading up to the assassination of India's then Prime Minister. This was a huge setback for India, a massive security and intelligence failure because a serving Prime Minister had been assassinated as a result of a terrorist movement. A terror movement that was sponsored as a covert war by our hostile neighbor, Pakistan. So this made India realize the dangers of covert war as well. So all these developments led the next government, the Rajiv Gandhi government, to take a step back. And India decided to scale back its involvement in Sri Lanka, especially the support that India was giving to LTTE was scaled back. Is that clear? As LTTE was becoming a notorious terrorist organization, right? And parallelly, India's Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had been assassinated following Operation Blue Star. Under Operation Blue Star, Indira Gandhi had ordered a strike on the sacred Golden Temple as Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, the then top Khalistan terrorist, had turned the sacred Golden Temple into a terror base. It was quite similar to Amrit Pal Singh, who's currently in news. In fact, Amrit Pal Singh, who's on the run right now, trying to revive Khalistan movement, he's inspired by Bhindranwale. And as India eliminated Bhindranwale in Operation Blue Star and killed a number of Khalistani terrorists, it triggered a backlash, which eventually led to the assassination of India's Prime Minister. So following these setbacks, India decided to scale back its involvement and withdraw some support given to LTTE. The Rajiv Gandhi government made it a priority to stabilize Sri Lanka right now. Because there was one more adverse development here. The LTTE had become so notorious that its influence had spread to Tamil Nadu. As Tamil refugees were frequently moving between Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka, as LTTE found a support base in Tamil Nadu, Tamil nationalist sentiments were spreading in Tamil Nadu as well. Tamil nationalism was rising, and there were few radical elements in Tamil Nadu seeking to separate Tamil Nadu from India. They were backing the Tamil Eelam demand of the LTTE. And some radical elements, they envisioned that if they break away all Tamil areas from India and Sri Lanka, together a large Tamil nation could be formed. So separatist sentiments started spreading in Tamil Nadu as well, which was a grave threat to our own internal security. Now that is the last thing India could afford. We already had a major crisis in Punjab, right? We had the major challenge of Northeast insurgency, Naxalism. And very soon, Kashmir also would witness insurgency and terrorism by 1987. So India couldn't afford another destabilization, that too in southern India, as Tamil nationalist sentiments were seen to be rising. This was the drawback of the Indian strategy. As India backed Tamil sentiments in Sri Lanka, we believed it would affect only Sri Lanka. But this quickly spread to Tamil Nadu as well because of the support base in Tamil Nadu. Remember I told you yesterday, several political parties in Tamil Nadu, several people as well, several radical elements, they sympathize with the Tamil cause. They sympathize with the Tamils who had faced atrocities at the hands of Sinhala Buddhists. At least this was understandable. But Tamil Eelam sentiments that was promoted by LTTE started spreading in the Indian state of Tamil Nadu. That is the last thing we could afford. There was no way India could allow Tamil nationalism to sustain itself. And Rajiv Gandhi government decided to put an end to it, to curb this at the very beginning. And the only option was to wipe out the LTTE, ensure that you bring the war to an end, the civil war to an end, and force LTTE to surrender. This was the only option for India. So as India withdrew the support, Rajiv Gandhi started pushing the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE towards talks. By using the last leverage that we had, we pressurized the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE, both of them, to come to the negotiating table, and India mediated a settlement by holding talks in Bhutan. Bhutan was chosen as a neutral venue. Usually, in such conflicts, when resolution takes place, the negotiations happen in third neutral countries. So India mediated these talks. We arranged the talks in Bhutan, in Thimphu, and we facilitated the talks between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE. So India played a direct role in this peace process. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi especially was personally invested in settling this dispute. We wanted an immediate end to the civil war so that Sri Lanka could be brought back to normalcy and we could put an end to Tamil militancy, which was now affecting Tamil Nadu as well. So this led to a peace process in 1985-1986. And after several rounds of negotiation, we finally worked out a historic peace agreement. After nearly 2 years of talks and negotiations, we convinced both the parties to put an end to this war. And the India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord was worked out, also called the Indo-Sri Lanka Peace Accord. It was signed in the year 1987. And this agreement is very, very important for our exam. This agreement has relevance even today. and you should know the provisions of the India-Sri Lanka Peace Accord. What did India negotiate? What conditions were placed on LTTE and what concessions were asked from the Sri Lankan government? This is something you should be familiar with. So under this agreement, India convinced the LTTE to surrender. Under the peace accord, India convinced LTTE to surrender, to lay down its arms, to end its militancy and insurgency and surrender, thus establishing a ceasefire in Sri Lanka. And if LTTE surrenders, we convince the Sri Lankan government as well to cease all the hostilities within 48 hours of signing the agreement. Sri Lanka agreed to put a stop to all its military operations. It agreed to stop all the military operations against the LTTE in the Tamil areas in northern and eastern provinces. Sri Lanka promised to return all the military forces back to the barracks, to withdraw the military forces from their deployment in northern and eastern provinces. So this would establish a ceasefire, thus bringing normalcy to the country. And in return, Sri Lanka agreed to devolve powers to the Tamil provinces. India convinced Sri Lanka to grant constitutional autonomy. We convinced Sri Lanka that if LTTE surrenders, if it ends the war, you please call for a ceasefire, withdraw your troops, and make constitutional changes. Amend your constitution to provide autonomy, to provide decentralization, that is devolution of powers. Devolve certain powers to the Tamil provinces, to the northern and eastern provinces. This was the commitment that India extracted from Sri Lanka. Now, why was autonomy needed? Why was the devolution of powers needed? Because this gives more rights to the Tamil people, to the Tamil population. This is something that had been deprived from the very beginning, right from the independence of Sri Lanka. It's because Tamils were not treated equally. It's because the areas were not developed, they were not given equal treatment. That's the reason why the militancy started in the first place, right? So giving autonomy to conflicted areas is one way of resolving the conflict. India itself has done this multiple times. In Northeast India, we have granted constitutional autonomy to several tribal areas under the 6th schedule of the Indian Constitution. We have given limited autonomy as well, right, without any constitutional status, and there are areas which enjoy such devolution of powers. So local people, they can look after their own administration in certain areas, in certain subjects. In Northeast India, for example, there are few autonomous areas. Ladakh also has autonomy, but not constitutional autonomy. But in Northeast India, there are few places, there are 10 administrative councils where constitutional autonomy has been given under the 6th schedule. This guarantees the subjects where the local body will have complete powers. Even the laws of the state and the center will not apply in the autonomous regions unless it is extended by the autonomous council. So the people of the region can decide upon their governance, their administrative issues, their judicial matters. They'll even be given financial powers. So such autonomy is often provided to resolve a conflict, to prevent the rise of extremism. So India convinced Sri Lanka as well on similar lines to grant constitutional autonomy to northern and eastern provinces and devolve powers by enacting the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution. Some of you might have heard about this, the 13th Amendment. This is in news even today. Even now, whenever India and Sri Lanka meet, India brings up the 13th Amendment issue. All right. These were the basic terms of the peace agreement. All right. Let me summarize this. India mediated this peace agreement between LTTE and the Sri Lankan government. We convinced LTTE to surrender, to put an end to its insurgent war. And in return, Sri Lanka also agreed for a ceasefire to withdraw the military troops. And it promised to provide constitutional autonomy and devolve powers to the 13th Amendment to the Tamil provinces of northern and eastern Sri Lanka. These are the promises that India extracted from both the parties. And India promised to deploy a peacekeeping force to enforce the terms of the accord, mainly to maintain the ceasefire, to keep LTTE under check, to ensure LTTE does not break the ceasefire. India decided to deploy its own troops, and the Indian peacekeeping force was constituted. By drawing from the Indian army, a peacekeeping force, a temporary peacekeeping force was constituted by India, and the Rajiv Gandhi government promised to help Sri Lanka. This is one reason why Sri Lanka agreed to the terms. Even Sri Lanka wanted an end to the conflict on some level, and India promised help. India said we will deploy troops on the ground, but not in a combat role. This would be a peacekeeping role, to maintain the peace, to maintain the ceasefire, to ensure especially LTTE will not break the terms of the agreement. So the agreement was signed. It was a historic event. Rajiv Gandhi was present. The Sri Lankan leaders and Prabhakaran, the leader of LTTE, was present. And in front of all of them, the agreement was signed. It was a historic accord. India believed we brought this conflict to an end. We deployed the IPKF, and that is when India was backstabbed by both the parties. After the peace agreement was signed, we genuinely expected both parties will uphold the agreement. But after going back to Sri Lanka, and after India deployed the IPKF, both the sides would backstab India. They would betray India. And this would become a nightmare experience for India. This became a disastrous involvement for India because now the IPKF became the target. The Indian soldiers who were deployed, they became the target for LTTE as LTTE refused to surrender. Is that clear? LTTE had only agreed for the sake of it, as it was under pressure in India. All right, as India was threatening to cut off all the support. But after the agreement was signed, Prabhakaran refused to surrender because he feared if LTTE surrenders, then Sri Lanka government will target the Tamil population. They will wipe out the Tamil population in northern and eastern provinces. So LTTE decided to retain its arms. It refused to surrender and continued the war, and now it started targeting the Indian forces, as Indian forces were responsible to enforce the ceasefire. Plus, LTTE had a grudge. It had a grudge against India. It had a grudge against Rajiv Gandhi. Because now LTTE believed India was simply playing geopolitics with the issue. LTTE believed that India had betrayed the Tamil cause. India had never supported Tamil Eelam. India was simply using the group to play geopolitics. So LTTE decided to take revenge against India, and IPKF forces became the target. Similarly, Sri Lanka also did not abide by the terms of the deal. The Sri Lankan government enacted the 13th Amendment, and provincial autonomy was given to Tamil areas. But however, this autonomy which has been given is very, very limited. Only in few subjects, few minor subjects, powers have been devolved to the northern and eastern provinces. So implementation of the 13th Amendment is not complete. It's not a full devolution of powers. It's only a partial devolution of powers. Key subjects such as land, police, revenue, such key subjects have been retained by the central government. Only a few minor subjects have been devolved to the provincial councils. This is the reason why we say that the 13th Amendment has not been completed. It's not been fully implemented. Even now when India and Sri Lanka meet, Indian side brings up this issue. We urge Sri Lanka to fully implement the 13th Amendment that was promised under the 1987 Peace Accord. Not only this, Sri Lanka would also betray India and target India. Why? Because Sri Lanka held India responsible for the entire crisis. Sri Lanka presumed it was because of India that LTTE had become stronger. It was India which had sponsored the LTTE. But Sri Lanka was conveniently ignoring the atrocities it had committed against Tamil minorities. With or without Indian support, LTTE or any Tamil militant group would have come up. because that was the scale of violence that Sri Lanka had committed against the Tamil population. So now Sri Lanka tried to target India as well. It betrayed India. And according to several reports, there are several intelligence reports of that period, which indicates that Sri Lanka passed on intelligence to the LTTE regarding the position of Indian forces. A collusion came up between Sri Lankan forces and the LTTE, as both of them hated India right now. To take revenge on India, reportedly Sri Lanka, which was aware of the deployment of Indian troops, where Indian troops were deployed, would pass on this information, this vital information to LTTE, so LTTE could target the Indian forces. So the number of attacks against Indian forces increased, and the IPKF took a lot of casualties. The IPKF took a very big hit in Sri Lanka. It became a disastrous military involvement because, see, first of all, we were not sent here on a combat role. Indian soldiers were not sent here on combat duty. Our objective was not to fight LTTE. It was a peacekeeping mission, a peacekeeping force to maintain the ceasefire. And Indian army was deployed without adequate preparation. It didn't even have basic maps of Sri Lanka. And also there was lack of coordination between Indian agencies. There was a lack of communication, lack of sharing of information between different agencies. Because on one hand, India's RAW was not willing to cut off all the ties with LTTE. Because RAW always saw LTTE as an asset which we could leverage to gain influence on the Sri Lankan government. The Intelligence Bureau was running its own parallel operations by connecting with the Tamil refugees in Tamil Nadu. The Tamil Nadu police, with the support of the state government, they were giving their own support to LTTE, which was parallel to the support given by the Indian government. So this multiple connections with LTTE and the extremists created confusion, chaos on the ground. Agencies wouldn't cooperate, wouldn't share information with each other. They would all try to protect their own sources. And the Indian army was essentially blind in Sri Lanka. It didn't have sufficient intelligence, didn't have the required maps. It wasn't prepared for a combat mission. It was never a combat mission. It was a peacekeeping mission. So as LTTE and Sri Lanka betrayed India, they targeted the Indian forces, and according to reports, Sri Lanka helped the LTTE. It passed on the information regarding position of Indian troops, so LTTE could target Indian troops and thus take revenge against India. This became a disastrous period, and over the next few months, close to 1,000 Indian soldiers were killed under this peacekeeping mission. Almost every day, Indian soldiers were coming back in body bags. This involvement of India became very unpopular within the Indian public, right, amongst the Indian opposition, the media. They started questioning India's disastrous involvement. They started asking why India is getting involved in Sri Lanka, why are we losing our soldiers? It became a very unpopular involvement and tarnished the image of Rajiv Gandhi as well. All right, Rajiv Gandhi's attempt was to restore normalcy, to end this conflict and to bring down the LTTE, which was a threat to India as well. But this strategy backfired as LTTE betrayed the promises and Sri Lankan government also betrayed India. This is how our covert involvement in Sri Lanka backfired. We lost the way, right? This is what happens whenever you sponsor an extremist group. The strategy backfired on India with very, very adverse consequences. Not only did we see a rise of Tamil nationalist sentiments in Tamil Nadu, not only it became a major internal political issue in India, it also led to the killing of around 1,000 Indian soldiers who lost their lives as part of this peacekeeping mission. All right, the LTTE repeatedly targeted Indian forces, reportedly with Sri Lanka's help, and thus they took their revenge against India. So as this involvement became very unpopular, as India's strategy had failed, India was forced to retreat. Eventually, after Rajiv Gandhi government fell, right, Rajiv Gandhi government became unpopular because of the Bofors scandal as well. It was a corruption scandal that broke out in the late 1980s. Eventually, the Rajiv Gandhi government fell, and we had two coalition governments. These were weak coalition governments. They weren't strong enough. They had very weak numbers in the parliament, and they formed the government for very few months, hardly around 1 year each. So then, as the war became unpopular, India decided to withdraw the troops, and IPKF was called back in 1990. So it was nearly a 2.5 to 3 years deployment, military deployment in Sri Lanka, and it was a disastrous involvement. We didn't achieve our objectives, right? The war didn't end. 13th Amendment was only partially implemented. It did not bring political and financial autonomy to the Tamil minorities. This is what we had asked from Sri Lanka. We had asked for greater political financial autonomy. We had asked for a greater devolution of powers, but Sri Lanka did not fulfill the promise. It only provided for a partial implementation of the 13th Amendment. Sri Lanka did establish the provincial councils. The autonomous councils were set up. You have them even today. You have the northern and eastern provincial councils. They have their own separate elections. And Tamil parties in Sri Lanka, such as the Tamil National Alliance, they win these elections and they administer these provincial autonomous councils. All right, periodic elections are held. Tamil parties win the elections even today, and they take care of the provincial administration. But the powers given to them is very limited, only in few minor subjects. All major subjects like land, police, law and order, revenue, they've all been reserved for the central government itself. The Sri Lankan government still has a lot of control over northern and eastern provinces. Apart from this, Sri Lanka finally recognized Tamil as an official language. This was under the 13th Amendment. Now you can understand the extent to which Tamils have been discriminated here. Even though Tamils were a significant part of the Sri Lankan population, for almost 40 years, the Tamil language was not even given official recognition. Only Sinhalese was recognized as the national language. It was enforced on the Tamils as well. The Tamil language, which is closely linked with the Tamil ethnic identity, was not even given recognition until 1987. It was because of India, because of the pressure we exerted for the 13th Amendment, the Tamil language was finally recognized by the Sri Lankan government. All right? So this was a very complicated equation for India as well. Yes, India made its share of mistakes, but however, it was complicated because of Sri Lanka's attitude, because of Sri Lanka's way of treating the Tamil minorities. So India did achieve a partial success in ensuring that 13th Amendment was passed and some form of autonomy, at least partial autonomy, was given to the provincial councils, and Tamil language was given official recognition. Is that clear? So this is what happened from 1987 to 1990. The civil war did not end. The civil war continued. Now the LTTE became stronger. As India was forced to retreat, as India retreated from Sri Lanka and pulled out the IPKF forces, it marked the defeat of India. In many ways, LTTE claimed victory over India. Imagine a terrorist group claiming victory over a large, powerful country like India. This allowed LTTE to become even more popular. It became even more stronger and popular right now because it had forced a powerful country like India to retreat. It had imposed a huge cost on the Indian armed forces and pushed them to retreat, thus allowing LTTE to claim victory against India. So as India scaled back its involvement, since the war became very unpopular amongst the Indian public, India had to scale back the involvement. The support had more or less been withdrawn by now. The earlier support we had given was almost completely withdrawn because this terror outfit had killed almost 1,000 Indian soldiers, right? So as India retreated, it allowed LTTE to become more popular and stronger, and the civil war continued. Now LTTE had access to more funds and weapons. I told you yesterday itself that from 1985, LTTE was no longer dependent on India. It was getting support from the Tamil diaspora around the world. Tamils around the world, a lot of them, they sympathized with what Tamils were suffering in Sri Lanka. They started funding the campaign. LTTE would build contacts with various other insurgent and terror groups and arms trafficking and criminal cartels, and it became a notorious global terror organization. According to Indian intelligence reports, LTTE would have contacts with Pakistan's ISI, Lashkar-e-Toiba, and at one point, even with Al-Qaeda. LTTE would build global contacts. It would start sourcing weapons, start smuggling drugs by working with organized criminal cartels. It destabilized the larger part of the Indian Ocean, enabled drug smuggling and arms trafficking, and it easily procured advanced weapons, and it started escalating the civil war. So the civil war continued to the 1990s. All right? And this is where a big development took place in the year 1991. In 1991, Indian politics was changing again. Right? Rajiv Gandhi had previously become unpopular in 1988, 87, 88. Rajiv Gandhi had lost his popularity because of the disastrous involvement in Sri Lanka, because of the loss suffered by the Indian peacekeeping forces, and also because of the Bofors corruption scandal. After 2 years of coalition government, Rajiv Gandhi was regaining his popularity. Is that clear? The coalition governments were weak, as I told you. They didn't have enough numbers. They fell very quickly. 2 coalition governments had fallen, and fresh elections had been announced in India in 1991. Within these 2 years, Rajiv Gandhi had regained his popularity again, and it was widely expected that his party, the Congress, is going to win the elections again. And Rajiv Gandhi was predicted to become the Prime Minister of the country again. Every opinion poll conducted indicated a popular sentiment in favor of Rajiv Gandhi, and it was very clear that Congress is going to win the elections with a full majority. So during this election campaign, Rajiv Gandhi and his party, the Congress party, they brought out a manifesto. In the election manifesto, Rajiv Gandhi made a commitment to wipe out LTTE and to stabilize Sri Lanka. This was an electoral promise made by Rajiv Gandhi. Is that clear? In the run-up to the 91 elections, the Congress party promised in the manifesto that if it is voted to power, India will target LTTE, which is right now a threat to India. The Congress party committed that India will wipe out the LTTE and will stabilize Sri Lanka. So as Rajiv Gandhi made this promise, this electoral promise, and since it was widely expected that he's going to become the PM again, now the LTTE started panicking. The LTTE decided that they have to prevent Rajiv Gandhi from becoming the PM again at any cost. And thus began LTTE's notorious plan to assassinate Rajiv Gandhi. Apparently, this operation was ordered by Prabhakaran himself. V. Prabhakaran, the leader of LTTE, would order this operation. Right? He was someone who was nurtured by India, supported by India's raw. Right? He was Indian asset at one point. Now he had turned against India, and he was planning the assassination of India's former Prime Minister. So during the election campaign, a few attempts were made by LTTE suicide bombers to target Rajiv Gandhi. But initial attempts did not succeed. But finally, in the last leg of the election campaign, the LTTE managed to succeed. LTTE suicide bombers who had come from Sri Lanka, they targeted Rajiv Gandhi in Tamil Nadu. Rajiv Gandhi was delivering an election rally. He was delivering a speech on the outskirts of Chennai. You have a place called Sri Perambur, which is on the outskirts of Chennai. So here, an election rally had been planned by the Congress party, and Rajiv Gandhi was delivering a speech. So over here, LTTE suicide bombers managed to penetrate the meeting. They got very close to Rajiv Gandhi and detonated the suicide bomb, the explosive vest that the bomber was wearing. This led to the killing of India's former Prime Minister, and again came as a huge setback to India. Is that clear? See here, it's not about the leader of the political party. It's more about the office that they have occupied. Losing a serving Prime Minister and a former Prime Minister is not it's not a minor thing. In 1984, a serving PM was assassinated by Khalistani extremists. Just few years later, a former PM was assassinated by another terror group, that is the LTTE. This highlights the risk and dangers of supporting extremist outfits and terror outfits. Is that clear? This was again a huge security failure. It was an intelligence failure. It was a massive setback for India. And after Rajiv Gandhi's assassination, public sentiment in India turned completely against Indian involvement in Sri Lanka. Indian involvement in Sri Lanka became highly unpopular. It's similar to how the American people started targeting the American involvement in Afghanistan or in Vietnam. Just like American wars in Vietnam and Afghanistan became unpopular, pushing US to retreat. Similarly, in India, India's involvement in Sri Lanka became very, very unpopular. Just a couple of years before this, Indian soldiers had suffered a big hit. Around 1,000 Indian soldiers were killed. Now, India's former Prime Minister had been assassinated. It was all because of LTTE. So public sentiment went against Indian involvement in Sri Lanka. So the next government, the P.V. Narasimha Rao government, had to take a backseat. P.V. Narasimha Rao government was forced to step back to end India's involvement, to stop all contacts with LTTE and the Sri Lankan government and not get directly involved in the civil war. All right. So as India retreated again, it allowed LTTE to thrive. And in the next decade, LTTE became a strong and notorious organization. From 1991 to 2001, there was no pressure on LTTE. Until then, at least India was putting some pressure. This pressure was withdrawn, and now LTTE became even more stronger, even more popular. Is that clear? The civil war continued in Sri Lanka. Through the 1990s, the civil war continued without any end. And LTTE kept carrying out multiple attacks in Sri Lanka. And it remained a major threat for India because these elements had some support in Tamil Nadu. All right? So this remained a major security threat, but India couldn't get directly involved because of the negative sentiment amongst the Indian public. So as a result, LTTE started regrouping. It became even more stronger. And by 2001, it became one of the most notorious terrorist outfits in the world. Is that clear? In 2001, when Al-Qaeda carried out the 9/11 attacks against US, the US declared a global war on terrorism. US started working with all its allies and even with other friendly countries. It built close ties with India as well. And it started targeting all terror groups in the world. Al-Qaeda was the primary target. So as the world started targeting terrorism and terror financing, it led to a crackdown on LTTE as well. Because at that point, it was assessed that LTTE was the second most notorious terror group after Al-Qaeda. According to US and European countries, after the Al-Qaeda, LTTE was the biggest terror outfit, the most serious security threat. Understood? Even though it wouldn't target Western countries, it still posed a concern for everyone as it had destabilized the Indian Ocean. And believe it or not, by 2001, LTTE had built a navy and an air force of its own. It had procured naval vessels, fast-moving boats, to carry out sea-based attacks. It had procured small aircrafts to carry out aerial attacks. And LTT was the only terror group at that point which had aircrafts of its own to carry out terror attacks. Not even Al-Qaeda had access to aircraft. Right? Al-Qaeda had to hijack commercial aircraft. But LTT had its own aircraft. It had procured aircrafts and fast boats through which it can carry out sea-based and air-based attacks as well. And LTT specialized in suicide bombing. It was one of the notorious outfits which specialized in suicide bombing. It often used women and children to wear the suicide vest. So most countries concluded that LTT is the second most notorious terror group after Al-Qaeda. So after the 9/11 attacks, as the global war on terrorism was launched, the countries started targeting terrorism, terror financing, terror sanctuaries, and money laundering. So there was a global response against these extremist activities. So this weakened the LTTE. Right? India started helping the US in counterterrorism. India and US started working together in the field of counterterrorism. We started sharing intelligence. We started working together. So around the world, countries started cooperating with each other to counter terrorism. So as they took steps against terror financing, money laundering, and terror sanctuaries, it took a hit on the LTTE as well. Because organized crime was also targeted at the global level. So this affected the flow of funds, flow of weapons to the LTTE. The crackdown on money laundering and arms smuggling affected the LTTE and it weakened the LTTE over the years. The Sri Lankan government also stepped up its operations targeting the LTTE. It started getting support from other countries. Right? India also started backing Sri Lanka as well. We supported the Sri Lankan government from 2001 onwards to help bring down the LTTE. So as the crackdown increased, it became weaker and finally it agreed for a ceasefire in 2002. As LTTE was weakened due to the global pressure, it agreed for a ceasefire and negotiations began between the Sri Lankan government and the LTTE. They started negotiating for a peaceful settlement to find a political solution to the conflict. So LTTE called an end to the operations. It briefly halted the operations. Sri Lanka also put an end to the operations and they started negotiating. These talks went on for 3 years and it was mediated by Norway. Norway acted as a third-party neutral mediator. Why Norway? Because Norway is a country which has declared neutrality in any conflict. Norway, Switzerland, then even Turkmenistan. These are few countries in the world which have declared permanent neutrality. They'll not side with any countries in a conflict. And Norway is known to help others mediate their disputes. Even Switzerland. Switzerland provides an opportunity for conflicting parties to go to Switzerland and talk and negotiate. Switzerland will take a backseat. It will only facilitate the talks. It will allow the two parties to negotiate and talk to each other. Similarly, Norway has played that role. For example, it mediated between the government of Israel and the Palestinian terror outfits, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Right? Norway played an important role in the Oslo Accords, which led to a political solution between the Palestinian outfits and the Israeli government. Similarly, Norway has offered to mediate between India and Pakistan as well. Norway has multiple times offered to mediate over the Kashmir issue to allow India and Pakistan to talk and resolve the issue. But India has rejected this because we don't want any third party involvement. All right. So Norway mediated these talks between Sri Lanka and LTTE. India was supportive of this because we knew Norway would play a neutral role. And behind the scenes, we were encouraging the peace process. This was a big relief for India. Right? This is what India wanted: a peaceful settlement, a political solution. So terrorism can be brought to an end, LTTE can be wiped out, and Tamil population, Tamil minorities can be protected with better rights, with more devolution of powers. This is what India was hoping for, and the talks were going on for almost 3 years, from 2002 to 2005. But before a final agreement could be reached, before the mediation could succeed, there was a big political change in Sri Lanka. The then Sri Lankan government, which supported the talks, lost elections, and a very controversial leader, a notorious leader, came up called Mahinda Rajapaksa. Mahinda Rajapaksa belongs to the right-wing, far right-wing section in Sri Lanka. He himself is a Sinhala Buddhist with conservative views. His party itself is a right-wing party, right, which aligns with majoritarian views of Sinhala Buddhists. They blame Tamils for all the problems in Sri Lanka. They held India responsible for all the problems, for supporting the Tamils and triggering the insurgency. So such a leader came to power. His party, which was a right-wing party, which had taken a strong stand against Tamils, came to power and Mahinda Rajapaksa became the president. Is that clear? Mahinda Rajapaksa, he personally blamed India. He said India is the problem. India is the one which supported this movement and created this problem for Sri Lanka by ignoring the atrocities that Sinhala Buddhists had committed against Tamil minorities. Mahinda Rajapaksa would very quickly become an anti-India leader. And to India's shock, he would emerge as a pro-China leader in the strategic Indian Ocean region. Now we were facing a new kind of threat, a new kind of challenge. All right? He would appoint his own brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, as the defense minister. His brother, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, became the defense minister, and they gave complete powers to the Sri Lankan army. They gave a free hand to Sri Lankan army to use massive force against LTTE, and they suspended the peace process. They suspended the talks, which were actually making progress. If the talks had continued, most likely it might have given a solution, a political peaceful solution. But since Rajapaksa brothers, Mahinda and Gotabaya Rajapaksa, since they came from the right-wing factions backing and supporting Sinhala Buddhist ideology, they believed that they shouldn't talk to the extremists. They believe Sri Lanka shouldn't be talking to the terrorists. Rather, we should use force. We should use the military to crush the rebellion, to wipe out the militancy. So Rajapaksa suspended the peace process. All the progress that was made was down the drain, and Sri Lanka declared the last phase of the civil war. Sri Lanka declared a full-out war against LTTE and gave complete powers to Sri Lankan army to use massive force, even disproportionate force, to target the LTTE. So in the name of counter-terrorism and counter-insurgency, large-scale human rights violations were committed. The Sri Lankan army and Sri Lankan armed forces, reportedly, they committed a lot of human rights violations. They targeted innocent Tamil civilians as well in the name of targeting LTTE. A lot of fake killings, rapes, murders, kidnappings, and tortures have taken place, leading to complete destabilization of Sri Lanka. These 3 years were brutal in northern and eastern provinces, and for India, the shocking development was Rajapaksa became an anti-India leader. He embraced China. This is where you need to understand the next part of the relationship, the next phase of the relationship. From 2005, China rose as a major power in the Indian Ocean. Right? By then, China had become a major economic power. It had established a strong manufacturing base. It was looking to dominate the world. So China's initial focus was on the Indian Ocean. China was very eager to establish its dominance here because it wanted to counter India, counter the Indian influence. And also, it was eager to secure its energy and trade routes in the Indian Ocean. because most of China's energy supplies comes from Indian Ocean, from West Asian countries. Just like India sources oil and gas from West Asian countries, similarly, China sources most of its oil and gas from West Asian countries. These energy shipments pass through the Indian Ocean to China. This is vital for Chinese economy. Most of China's trade, export, imports pass through the Indian Ocean. So China wants to control the trade routes, stabilize its energy supplies, and more importantly, counter India's predominant influence in the Indian Ocean. So with this objective in mind, China started emerging as a major power in the Indian Ocean. The PLA Navy would start expanding its military influence, and China would start expanding its diplomatic influence as well, all across the Indian Ocean. So throughout this chapter, when we look at Maldives, Mauritius, and Seychelles, I'll keep pointing out the rise of China in the Indian Ocean, how it threatens India's interests. All right. So Sri Lanka was the beginning. China made a beginning in the Indian Ocean by establishing its firm presence and influence in Sri Lanka. It got very, very close to Mahinda Rajapaksa. Is that clear? You should know how China became close to Mahinda Rajapaksa. One, they offered massive funds, massive investments. See, Rajapaksa was an authoritarian leader. And in any authoritarian government, there will be massive corruption. All right. Slowly, Rajapaksa family came to dominate the Sri Lankan government. He had multiple family members within the government, not just his brother, who was a defense minister. He had many other family members who were given lucrative positions in the government. So large-scale corruption was going on. Rajapaksa family was becoming stronger and influential. Sri Lanka was promised massive funds and investments in the form of Chinese loans. Right? China promised to give concessional loans, and it started investing in strategic projects. Now, this was very attractive for Sri Lanka, especially to the Rajapaksa government. This was very attractive because China would execute key projects, thus helping Sri Lanka. Plus, the funds and investments would be diverted easily, and the Rajapaksa brothers could become richer and politically stronger. Right? A lot of wasteful expenditure took place, irrational borrowing was done, and China became very, very close to the Rajapaksa government. The money played a very big role, the Chinese money, right? The cheap loans that reportedly China was giving. And more importantly, in the last phase of the war, in the last phase of the civil war, between 2006 and 2009, Rajapaksa government had made it a priority to wipe out LTT, correct? So Mahinda Rajapaksa was looking for India to support. He was checking whether India would support Mahinda Rajapaksa. He wanted intelligence, he wanted weapons. Now, unfortunately, this is something India couldn't do. India was actually wanting to do this, right? Right now, we were becoming more pragmatic in our diplomacy. For India, right now, the bigger threat was China, not LTTE. And this was the right opportunity for us. To counter China, we had to get closer to Rajapaksa. And by supporting Rajapaksa, we could eliminate LTTE, which was a target for India as well. We could have hit both the birds with one stone. Right? Our objective was to counter the rising Chinese influence. And second was to wipe out LTTE. And it was easy for India to get closer to Rajapaksa as well. Even we could have given funds, weapons, and shared intelligence. And the Indian government was looking to do that. Right? India wanted to counter China in the Indian Ocean, get closer to Rajapaksa government, support Rajapaksa, give all the military support as well, provide logistics, provide intelligence and weapons. So Rajapaksa government could wipe out LTTE. But unfortunately, India couldn't do this. India couldn't implement this pragmatic policy because of political pressure from Tamil Nadu. Since there was a lot of support towards the Tamils in Sri Lanka, there was support towards LTTE as well. There was tremendous pressure from Tamil Nadu, and regional coalition politics ended up derailing India's foreign policy with Sri Lanka. Is that clear? India actually wanted to help the Sri Lankan government. The then Manmohan Singh government realized the threat from China. Plus, by helping Sri Lanka, we could wipe out LTTE, which was a major threat for India as well. So the Indian government was looking to help Sri Lanka and Rajapaksa, but we couldn't do it because the Manmohan Singh government was a weak coalition government. It didn't have enough numbers in the parliament. It depended on coalition partners like the DMK, a major regional party from Tamil Nadu. Similarly, other parties as well, AIADMK, the WIPO faction, they've all promoted Dravidian nationalism or Tamil nationalism, supported the Tamil cause in Sri Lanka, and they put a lot of pressure on the Indian government to not support the Sri Lankan government. Is that clear? See, practicality dictated that India should have supported Rajapaksa, even at the risk of human rights violations. Right? It would have helped India counter the Chinese influence. We would have become closer to Rajapaksa, and we could have wiped out the LTTE, which was in India's interest. India wanted to do this, but the government of India was held hostage. It was literally blackmailed by political parties from Tamil Nadu. Political pressure increased in Tamil Nadu, and every time India gave any support to Sri Lanka, there would be protests, violence in Tamil Nadu. It would further increase Dravidian Tamil nationalism. That is something India couldn't afford. So India was forced to take a step back. India was forced not to support Rajapaksa government during the last phase of the civil war. So when India couldn't supply weapons and intelligence, guess who supported Rajapaksa? It was obviously China. China gave tremendous military support. China supplied weapons, communication equipment, intelligence as well to Sri Lanka. So this is how China became extremely close to the Rajapaksa government. Economically, it gave funds and investments, invested in strategic projects. Second, it gave military support as well, right? Built very close strategic and security relations, supplied weapons during the last phase of the civil war, thus helping Sri Lanka to wipe out LTTE. Because of the Chinese support, Sri Lanka succeeded in 2009. In 2009, LTTE was decimated and the civil war was brought to an end. All right, many top leaders of LTTE were killed, including V. Prabhakaran. Prabhakaran was assassinated by Sri Lankan forces, thus marking the end of LTTE. So as LTTE was defeated, the civil war came to an end and Sri Lanka restored normalcy in the country. However, this came with a very big cost, a very big price. There were large-scale human rights violations that had been committed by Sri Lankan forces. The Sri Lankan government had allowed this to happen. It had tolerated the human rights violations. In the name of targeting LTTE, they had even targeted Tamil civilians. Lakhs of Tamilians were displaced, and India was deeply concerned about these developments. India was very concerned about the Tamil minorities. See, we wanted LTTE to be wiped out, but at the same time, we wanted the Tamil population to be protected. All right, but India didn't have the leverage as China became more influential, and Rajapaksa emerged as an anti-India leader. Mahinda Rajapaksa would start compromising on India's interests. He would become a pro-China leader. Is that clear? So as India was not able to help Rajapaksa, and as the Sri Lankan government became anti-India, it allowed China to gain a strategic influence in the Indian Ocean. very quickly, China gained a strategic influence and started countering India's traditional influence in the Indian Ocean. China won strategic projects. I'll show you the list of projects later. We'll come to it. Just know that China started taking up key strategic projects in Sri Lanka. And more importantly, China started carrying out military deployment with the help of Sri Lanka. Is that clear? China built strategic ports, the Colombo port, Hambantota port. It built many other roads, power plants, and key projects were executed. And the Chinese Navy, the PLA Navy, was allowed to bring naval ships, spy vessels, and even nuclear submarines to these strategic ports. Sri Lanka would allow the Chinese Navy to bring these vessels, which was a direct threat to India's security interests. At the Colombo port, for example, Mahinda Rajapaksa allowed China's nuclear submarines to be docked. Now, this was a grave threat to India. Nuclear-powered submarines, they can last longer. They can remain underwater for a long time. They're harder to detect. And more importantly, they will carry nuclear missiles on board. So Chinese nuclear submarines were docked in Colombo, right next to India's coastline, just few nautical miles away from India. So India saw this as a major threat. Even recently, you would have heard in news last year, a Chinese spy vessel was docked at Hambantota and Colombo, and Sri Lanka allowed this to happen. So clearly, Sri Lanka was turning against India, allowing China to set up its military presence in the Indian Ocean. So we saw the rise of China's economic, diplomatic, and military influence. Right, this undermined India's influence, and Rajapaksa was acting against India, giving key projects to China, taking all support from China, and allowing China to project its military influence against India. During this time, there was one opportunity we got, one opportunity for the Manmohan Singh government to repair the damage. This was in 2012, 2013. Sri Lanka was brought up at UNHRC for human rights violations by the Western countries. The Western countries targeted Sri Lanka over human rights violations. A lot of NGOs and human rights organizations, they conducted investigative studies, and they pointed out evidence to show that Sri Lankan forces had committed grave atrocities and war crimes during the last phase of the civil war. So led by UK, Canada, US, and other Western countries, a resolution was brought up at UNHRC, the UN Human Rights Council. The Sri Lankan government, Rajapaksa government, was alleged to have committed war crimes. War crime allegations were brought up, and at this point, Sri Lanka was looking for help from India. It expected India to support at the UNHRC because India has influence at UNHRC. The Manmohan Singh government saw this as an opportunity, and India wanted to support Sri Lanka. India had decided initially to support Sri Lanka and defeat this Western resolution. Because see, if the resolution is adopted, it could lead to investigations from the UNHRC. It could allow Western countries to meddle and interfere in Sri Lanka. So that is something India didn't want. We wanted to protect Sri Lanka from any Western interference. Because Western countries use human rights as an excuse. Western countries are not generally concerned about human rights here. For them, it's an excuse to meddle in Sri Lanka. Their focus was to counter the Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean. So India decided to support Sri Lanka's government, despite the bad relations we had. Manmohan Singh government decided this was the opportunity to win Rajapaksa and his favor towards India. So India was looking to vote against the resolution and protect Sri Lanka. But at the last minute before the voting, massive protests broke out in Tamil Nadu. Large-scale protests broke out, including violence in Tamil Nadu, and DMK, a coalition partner in the UPA government, threatened to withdraw from the government. The DMK threatened that if India supports Sri Lanka, if it defeats the resolution, then DMK threatened to pull out from the government, which would have led to the collapse of the Manmohan Singh government. This was backed by other parties as well. It's not just one party in Tamil Nadu. All the political parties were supporting this, AIDMK and other factions. They all threatened India, and large protests broke out in Tamil Nadu. This regional political pressure, coalition pressure, again derailed Indian diplomacy towards Sri Lanka. It's quite similar to how political pressure from West Bengal has derailed our ties with Bangladesh. We have not been able to sign the peace agreement even today, right? Because there is pressure from West Bengal. So this is how regional coalition politics, domestic politics, can derail our diplomacy, can derail our foreign policy objectives. So the Manmohan Singh government was forced at the last minute to change the vote. At the last minute, India changed the vote, or else the Indian government itself would have fallen, right? So India changed the vote at the last minute, and we supported the Western resolution. We voted in favor of the Western resolution, and thus Sri Lanka felt betrayed by India. Now Mahinda Rajapaksa was even more angry that India was failing to protect Sri Lanka at such platforms. So Rajapaksa became even more anti-India and started encouraging pro-China sentiments. This continued in 2013 again, when the second resolution was brought up. Is that clear? So thus Indian influence in Sri Lanka had been compromised for a very long period of time. Then came the Modi government in 2014, which had enough numbers in the parliament. It was a majority government, not a coalition government anymore, right? So coalition governments tend to be weaker because of the coalition partners. So the Modi government, which had enough numbers in the parliament, started taking a more balanced stand. When voting came up in 2014, India abstained from the vote. Even recently in 2020, there was another vote against Sri Lanka at UN Human Rights Council. Even on this Western resolution, India abstained from the vote. We took the neutral stand, the middle path. We didn't vote against or for, we abstained from both the votes. All right? So at least 4 votings have taken place at UNHRC against Sri Lanka. All are Western resolutions. In the first 2 resolutions in 2012, 2013, India voted against it. Right? We voted against Sri Lanka basically. We supported the resolutions of the Western countries because of political compulsions, because of political pressure from Tamil Nadu. This affected India-Sri Lanka relations. But the last 2 resolutions in 2014 and the latest one, India has abstained from the vote. All right? Now some of you might ask, why didn't India fully protect Sri Lanka right now? Why are we abstaining from the vote? See, abstaining in itself is an important decision. Many think abstaining means you're not taking a decision. That's not the case. The decision to abstain in itself is a big decision. The reason why Modi government has abstained and not fully supported Sri Lanka, we have not fully supported Sri Lanka at UNHRC, even though you have a majority government. All right, you need to understand this. See, the Modi government has enough numbers. It need not depend on political parties from Tamil Nadu, right? It can go ahead and support Sri Lanka entirely at UNHRC. But still, Modi government has deliberately decided to not fully support Sri Lanka, and we only abstain. We don't vote against the resolution. The reason is, we want a leverage on Sri Lanka. We want to send out a message, a symbolic message. What's the message? We want to tell Sri Lanka that we are ready to protect. We are ready to protect Sri Lanka from Western interference. We are ready to do this. But we need a guarantee about the protection and well-being of Tamil minorities. We need a guarantee about Chinese influence. This is what India expects from Sri Lanka. Is that clear? India is ready to support. We will vote against the resolution, defeat the Western resolution, protect Sri Lanka entirely. If Sri Lanka shows progress on 13th Amendment, if Sri Lanka protects Tamil minorities, provides more devolution of powers, and takes care of the well-being and the growth and development of the Tamil community, this is a priority for the Indian government. Next, Sri Lanka should guarantee that Indian influence will not be compromised. Indian interest will not be compromised by the rising Chinese influence. For this, you need some leverage on Sri Lanka. That is one reason why India has abstained. By abstaining, you're sending a message that, see, we are ready to protect you. We are not voting against your country. We're not supporting the resolution. We are abstaining from it. But at the same time, if you go against us, if you promote Chinese influence, if you continue targeting Tamil minorities, we will not hesitate to withdraw the support. We will not hesitate to vote against Sri Lanka again. Right? So that is the diplomatic leverage for India. Hence, Modi government has abstained from the vote in the last two resolutions. Understood? So this whole period was a difficult period for India. From 2005 to 2015, this entire term of Mahinda Rajapaksa, was a difficult period as Indian interests were compromised in Sri Lanka. Is that clear? Then came a big change in 2015. It was a huge relief for India that Mahinda Rajapaksa lost the elections. And a friendly government came up under Maithripala Sirisena. Maithripala Sirisena comes from a party which is often seen as pro-India. So from 2015 to 2019, we had a friendly government in Sri Lanka. Is that clear? We got a friendly government under Sirisena. This allowed India to slightly improve the relations, and we signed the landmark civil nuclear agreement in 2015. Is that clear? This is a big development because with our neighboring countries, we have nuclear cooperation only with Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. All right? This was the first civil nuclear agreement of India with a neighboring country, that is with Sri Lanka. We're also helping Bangladesh parallelly to build the Ropur nuclear plant, which is a Russian project. Russia is helping Bangladesh to build a nuclear power plant at Ropur. Russia is giving the nuclear reactor, the technology and the nuclear fuel. And India is also part of this agreement. We are helping Bangladesh in the construction of the power plant. All right? India is working with Russia and Bangladesh to help in the construction of the Ropur nuclear plant. So these are the two civil nuclear cooperation arrangements we have with our neighbors. So a landmark civil nuclear deal was signed. India has long-term plans to set up nuclear reactors in Sri Lanka. All right? This was a better period for us as relations improved. India managed to regain some influence. We managed to counter China as well to an extent. And India won many key infrastructure projects during this period. Is that clear? Between 2015 to 2019, under the Maithripala Sirisena government, the relations slightly improved. We not only signed a civil nuclear deal, but improved our influence. We won many key infrastructure projects and managed to counter Chinese influence to an extent. So this was a slightly better period in India-Sri Lanka relations. All right? But however, problems started again in 2019. There was an internal crisis, a constitutional crisis in Sri Lanka that led to the fall of the Maithripala Sirisena government. Sirisena had to resign. Fresh elections were held, and in 2019, the Rajapaksa brothers came back to power. And this time, Gotabaya Rajapaksa became the president. The former defense minister, who was accused of human rights violations and war crimes, came to power as the president. And his brother Mahinda Rajapaksa, the former president, he became the prime minister. So the two brothers were back in power, this time as president and prime minister of the country. So under the Rajapaksa government, problems started again from 2019 to 2022. Is that clear? We again saw a rise of Chinese influence, a fall of Indian influence. Rajapaksa cancelled many Indian projects. Many projects India had won under the previous government were cancelled by the Rajapaksa government. These projects were being handed over to Chinese companies. So we again saw a decline of Indian influence as Rajapaksa brothers continued their pro-China approach. They continued their anti-India policy, and this was a serious concern for India. But by this time, Sri Lanka was pushing itself into a grave economic crisis. I'm sure all of you know this. Last year, Sri Lanka went bankrupt, right? It couldn't repay the loans it had borrowed. Its economy has crashed, and today Sri Lanka is going through a massive economic crisis. This crisis did not happen all of a sudden. It's been in the making since the last 20 years. There are many reasons why the Sri Lankan economy collapsed. Let me highlight the reasons so you can clearly understand why the crisis happened. All right? Before I talk about the reasons, let me point out the situation that Sri Lanka faced last year. By 2021, Sri Lanka's forex reserves were depleting. You can see here in the graph how after 2010, you see a rise in forex reserves and a sudden fall in Sri Lanka's forex reserves. Because Sri Lanka was not earning forex reserves. Its primary sources of forex reserve, tourism and exports, had taken a hit. Key Sri Lankan exports were hit and tourism had suffered. Along with this, Sri Lanka spent all the forex reserves in repaying the loans, the expensive loans that Sri Lanka had borrowed. So forex reserves depleted and public debt shot up exponentially in Sri Lanka. Public debt increased to such an extent that Sri Lanka was no longer able to pay the loans. It was no longer able to repay the heavy loans it had borrowed. All right? So this triggered a BOP crisis, a balance of payments crisis, meaning Sri Lanka did not have enough forex reserves left to sustain its key imports. Without forex reserves, you cannot continue your foreign imports. So as a result, essential commodities, essential goods couldn't be procured by Sri Lanka. Even basic medicines, paper, fuel, they couldn't be procured by Sri Lanka because its forex reserves had been depleted. So essential items were in shortage, which triggered a massive inflation in the country. A massive inflation was triggered. You can clearly see here how the foreign debt of Sri Lanka has exponentially gone up since early 2000. In the last 15-20 years, Sri Lanka has borrowed heavily from foreign donors. It has borrowed not just from China. Around 10% of Sri Lankan loans are from China. It has borrowed from Japan as well, borrowed from India, from World Bank, from IMF, and also from the international market, and also from ADB. Sri Lanka has borrowed heavily from international donors over the years. So heavy external borrowing has been the primary problem, the root problem. Most of these loans have been used for wasteful expenditure by subsequent Sri Lankan governments, especially by the Rajapaksa governments. The corrupt Rajapaksa government has taken heavy loans, diverted the money to enrich themselves. Even the other governments as well have been irresponsible in their spending. They have borrowed heavily from China, from Japan, India, World Bank, ADB, and international markets, and they have spent this on wasteful projects, on projects which will not fetch revenue, projects which will not sustain and work. So this is the root cause of the problem, one of the primary causes. So as a result, Sri Lanka's currency depreciated against the dollar. You can see how Sri Lanka's currency has rapidly depreciated, thus directly contributing to rise in prices. Essential commodities were in shortage, even basic food items were not available. The people of Sri Lanka suffered immensely as prices shot up exponentially. There was a shortage of petrol and diesel, shortage of medicines, shortage of essential food items. Even paper was not available, so exams could not be held. Exams had to be postponed in schools and colleges. Newspapers weren't printed. This was the extreme crisis that Sri Lanka faced last year. All right, and the core problem here is not just the economic mismanagement by the Rajapaksa government and other Sri Lankan governments, and it's not just the heavy loans and the debt burden. There are other factors which contributed as well, especially the slowdown in its domestic economy, the decline in its exports, and recent shocks to the Sri Lankan economy. For example, the Rajapaksa government under Gotabaya Rajapaksa, irrational economic policies were adopted. A few years ago, in 2020, Gotabaya Rajapaksa banned the usage of fertilizers, chemical fertilizers, and pesticides, and overnight switched the country to organic farming. This was not scientific, it was not well thought out. It was inspired by irrational right-wing ideology of the Rajapaksa government. They put an end to the import of fertilizers, which was a big part of Sri Lanka's import bill. They banned the import of fertilizers and forced Sri Lanka's agriculture to switch to organic farming overnight. Now, when you do this without much thought, without planning ahead, obviously it will hit agri production. Agriculture production in Sri Lanka took a massive hit, and especially its key exports, its critical exports, spices, tea, rubber, they took a massive hit, thus affecting Sri Lanka's domestic economy and exports. Exports declined, domestic production got affected. All right, plus they continued spending on wasteful projects. The loans kept on increasing, the debt burden kept piling on, but along with that, Sri Lanka came up with such irrational policies like switching to organic farming without fertilizer usage, which directly hit agri production and affected Sri Lanka's exports. Along with this, there were recent shocks. In 2019, there was a major terror attack called the Easter Sunday bombings, carried out by a terrorist group called National Tawheed Jamaat, which is aligned with Islamic State, with ISIS. Is that clear? There's a Sri Lankan terror organization called NTJ, National Tawheed Jamaat. This terror group is linked with ISIS or Islamic State. It carried out a major attack on multiple churches in Sri Lanka on Easter Sunday, right, on the occasion of Easter festival in 2019. Simultaneous bombings took place. This was the biggest terror attack in Sri Lanka in many years. This took a direct hit on tourism. For Sri Lanka, tourism is a very big source of revenue. A lot of tourists come from India and around the world. This revenue was hit because of the massive attack, the Easter Sunday attack. Then came the pandemic, the travel restrictions, the lockdowns, and Russia-Ukraine war. These events disrupted the global supply chains, increased the cost of essential commodities, food items, basic fuel, medicines, the cost increased, and it also hit tourism. The lockdown restrictions, which lasted for a good 2 years, destroyed Sri Lanka's tourism sector, which was a critical source of foreign exchange. So all these events contributed to the collapse of Sri Lankan economy. The decades of mismanagement, the corruption, especially under Rajapaksa government, the mismanagement and heavy loans taken from outside, the debt burden that the country fell into, plus irrational policies like banning fertilizers, switching to organic farming, and the terror attack, the pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, all these events contributed to the collapse of the Sri Lankan economy. Is that clear? Whatever forex reserves were built, they had to be spent to repay the loans, thus crashing the Sri Lankan economy. It wasn't left with any forex reserves and triggered the BOP crisis. So during this crisis, it was India which reached out and helped Sri Lanka. Now the Rajapaksa brothers reached out to India asking for help. From 2019 itself till 2022, Rajapaksa brothers tried to improve relations with India because they knew they would need India's help, India's support to overcome the crisis. But eventually, even though India gave assistance, Rajapaksa brothers couldn't sustain the crisis. The people rose up in rebellion. Right? The people were frustrated with their rule. They rebelled and they threw out the Rajapaksa brothers from power. Rajapaksa brothers even fled the country. They ran away from Sri Lanka because the people clearly blamed Rajapaksa brothers for the whole crisis. And as a result, Rajapaksa brothers have been removed from power. All right. So today the crisis continues. You have a national unity government. Various parties have come together to form a temporary government, a coalition government. They are looking to restructure the loans to rebuild the Sri Lankan economy, and they are eagerly looking forward for an IMF support, IMF bailout package. Right? Recently, IMF has approved the support package as well of around $3 billion. You might have read this in news yesterday that IMF is approving around $3 billion worth of financial package to Sri Lanka. But IMF support is always conditional. The problem in taking support from IMF is that you have to implement certain reforms, economic reforms. IMF will force you to devalue the currency. It will force you to introduce market reforms. Right? This will allow Western companies to easily enter and dominate the market. So sometimes you are forced by the IMF to make these changes if you have to get assistance from IMF during the crisis. That's why IMF has become unpopular amongst developing countries and smaller countries. The IMF, which is dominated by Western countries, is often seen to impose these conditions, which benefits Western countries and Western companies. That's why there is a hesitance in asking help from IMF. India itself is a victim of this. We suffered from this as well because in 91, when we faced a similar BOP crisis, even we took support from IMF. When India got the bailout package, IMF conditions had to be followed by India. We had to devalue the currency, open up our markets against our wishes. It compromises our economic sovereignty and allows Western countries and companies to play a bigger role in your economy. So this has always been an issue with the IMF. But Sri Lanka needs the support to survive. So it has been looking to restructure the loans. It has asked for help, and a bailout package has been recently approved from the IMF. But the most important point here is the help that India has given. The tremendous assistance India has given. In the last 1.5 years, we have given around $4 billion in support. $4 billion worth of assistance has been extended by India. We gave a $400 million currency swap arrangement under the SARC framework. Under the SARC grouping, there's a currency swap arrangement which is facilitated by the Reserve Bank of India. All right. In a currency swap, you swap your currencies. Sri Lanka will deposit its currency, the Sri Lankan rupee, with the RBI, and RBI will pay US dollars in return, the global reserve currency in return. In return for Sri Lankan rupees, we will pay in dollars. All right. This is a temporary arrangement where you're swapping the currency. How does it help? Sri Lanka will print, it'll have enough currency of its own. Let's say Sri Lanka will give $100 million worth of currency to India. RBI will keep the currency, it'll hold the currency. In return, it will give the $100 million US dollar equivalent in US dollars. Sri Lanka will now use the dollars to repay the loans to overcome the crisis. And at a later date, after a few years, according to the agreed deadline, Sri Lanka will buy back the rupees and it will return the dollars to the RBI. This is a currency swap arrangement. All right. It could be done in our domestic currencies as well. But unfortunately, Indian rupee is not valid internationally. It does not play a role in the international markets. Right. So we provide US dollars and we hold the Sri Lankan currency. So Sri Lanka can use the dollars for $400 million for the time being, repay the loans, overcome the crisis. At a later date, it'll have to repay that. It'll have to take back the Sri Lankan rupees by returning the dollars to the RBI. So this is a currency swap arrangement. Even India has such arrangements with Japan and few other countries. India and Japan have a currency swap arrangement. Is that clear? Indian rupees and the Japanese currency will be exchanged. And it will help India to overcome any immediate payment crisis situations. So we have extended $400 million of currency swap arrangement to the RBI under the SARC framework. There was another loan, an old loan Sri Lanka had borrowed from India of $500 million. It was supposed to repay the loan to Asian Clearing Union, which is based in Turkey, in Istanbul. Asian Clearing Union is a financial institution. It provides for international settlements. It settles international payments. Through Asian Clearing Union, Sri Lanka was supposed to pay back India $500 million on an older loan. We have deferred the repayment. India has restructured the loan and pushed the repayment deadline. Sri Lanka need not repay the amount right now. We have given an extended window and we have deferred the repayment, thus giving a breathing space. We gave a fresh loan of $500 million, a line of credit, for importing fuel from India as fuel supplies were declining. A fuel shortage was being reported, which was crippling the Sri Lankan economy. Right? So India gave a special loan for this purpose for importing fuel from India, a concessional line of credit. Another $1 billion credit facility for food, medicines, and essential items. And we even dispatched free aid. Apart from all the loans, we have even given free aid. Indian Navy supplied essential items like milk, sugar, wheat, rice, etc. in the initial period of the crisis. Because the people of Sri Lanka, the common man, they were struggling, suffering. Basic food was not available in the country. So India supplied essential items free of cost as aid to a neighboring country. We have kept another $2 billion ready if required in order to counter China. It's very interesting to note here, China has not helped Sri Lanka as expected. Even though 10% of the loans is from China, right? China has not helped Sri Lanka as expected. This shows how China leverages its trade and economic advantages for geopolitical advantages. While India has willingly helped Sri Lanka, India has gone beyond what it was supposed to do. We have given the biggest support of around $4 billion. But China has largely not supported Sri Lanka. It has only promised support. It has given a few $1 million in support, nothing more than that. This is seen as a deliberate strategy. Many experts believe China is doing this deliberately because it has a debt burden. It has a debt control. It has Sri Lanka under its debt trap. By giving massive loans, it has trapped Sri Lanka under its debt burden. So maybe China is trying to exploit this. Maybe it will seek strategic military advantages in return for economic support and financial assistance. Right? That is why even when India was giving the support, Sri Lanka allowed a Chinese spy vessel to be docked in Colombo and Hambantota, even though India protested against this. All right, the Yongwang, which was a Chinese spy ship, right? That was recently in news. This spy ship came to Hambantota and Colombo, docked for many days, even though India protested against it. Even though India was giving support, Sri Lanka didn't heed to India's request because Sri Lanka might be blackmailed. It might be pushed by China because China has a debt trap. It has a debt control over Sri Lanka. So this becomes quite evident from the fact that China has not helped Sri Lanka. It has not given large assistance. It is India which has given large support to Sri Lanka, helped the country sustain its economy for the time being. All right. So this helps you understand the complex geopolitics of Sri Lanka and the Indian Ocean, the complex game between India and China. Right. Sometimes we are working with Sri Lanka, we are against Sri Lanka. So it's a very complicated equation, but I've tried to simplify it, I've tried to break it down, and I hope everything is clear. We have covered the entire political history, the history of our diplomatic ties. We have spoken about the economic crisis as well, and we are left with few small topics which we can cover after a short break. All right. Right now it's 7:45. Let's take a break till 8 a.m. Take a 15 minutes break. We'll come back and wrap up the few remaining topics. There are a few small topics left. We'll complete this. I take all your doubts, all your questions, and we'll also look at India and Maldives after this. All right. So see you back at 8 a.m. Hello everyone. Welcome back to the session. Now we are left with few small topics under India, Sri Lanka. Let's wrap it up. And then once we complete this topic, I'll take all your doubts and questions. All right. The next topic for discussion is the fishermen dispute between India and Sri Lanka. This is another pressing issue which has remained for many years, and the issue has not been resolved even today. Every now and then the fishermen dispute comes up. It affects the relations between the two countries. So let's understand what is the fishermen dispute. Why does this dispute arise? See, India, Sri Lanka share a maritime border. We share an extensive maritime border in the Gulf of Mannar Park Strait region. Correct? Over here, the maritime boundary was agreed through agreements that we signed in 1974 and 1976. In 1976 itself, we settled our maritime boundary in line with international law. Later, we have abided by UN clause provisions according to UN Convention on Law of the Sea. We have clearly demarcated our respective exclusive economic zones. You can clearly see that in the map here. This is Gulf of Mannar region. This is Park Bay. Very important locations between India and Sri Lanka. And this is the India-Sri Lanka maritime boundary line. This is Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone. You can see here that since our EEZ will overlap, Sri Lanka has been given extra EEZ towards the south-southeast region. Sri Lanka has been compensated for the loss in its EEZ as India and Sri Lanka are located very close to each other. Similarly, India also has been compensated on the other side. India has got a slightly extra EEZ towards the Kerala coastline to compensate for the loss that we incur here as Sri Lanka is located right next to India. This is what I was talking about in the previous class when we discussed UN clause. I explained that countries work out their maritime boundaries according to UN clause provisions. They can look for customized solutions if 2-3 countries are located very close to each other. So this arrangement has been made. The maritime boundary is settled. We have no issues as such. But the problem is the fishermen in Tamil Nadu, especially the rich fishermen, they get a lot of political support from the state government. Tamil Nadu government, as you know, is known to provide a lot of subsidies. Since it prioritizes welfare and socio-economic development, it gives a lot of subsidies, sometimes populist schemes as well, to please the voters. So in Tamil Nadu, the state government has given a lot of political and financial support. It has created a lot of economic incentives, which has allowed many fishermen, especially some of the bigger and the rich fishermen, to procure mechanized boats on a large scale. They have procured mechanized boats, and they practice an exploitative form of fishing called bottom trawling. Bottom trawling is highly exploitative. Under this method of fishing, large fishing nets are dropped to the seabed, to the seafloor. They are dragged on the seafloor with the mechanized boat, and it catches everything that is present at the seabed. Right? This brings up a huge catch of fish. It increases the profits for the fishermen. All right, but the problem is it is environmentally unsustainable. It will destroy the fishing resources. It will not allow nature enough time to replenish the fish. So this is a biodiversity concern. That is why bottom trawling is actually prohibited in many countries, in many regions. Even India has tried to discourage bottom trawling, but in Tamil Nadu, fishermen frequently they practice bottom trawling. They also practice another controversial form of fishing called Persine fishing. Persine fishing is done in the middle waters. If bottom trawling happens at the bottom of the seabed, Persine fishing happens in the middle waters. Even this is widely popular in India and around the world as well, and especially in Tamil Nadu. Persine fishing is also practiced in the middle waters. Only the rich and the big fishermen with mechanized boats can carry out bottom trawling and Persine fishing. These methods of fishing are considered to be exploitative as it catches a lot of other organisms as well. Even those fishes, organisms which are not consumed, which are not edible, even they get trapped in these nets. Even turtles, seahorses, and many other important marine organisms get trapped in bottom trawling and Persine fishing. So according to experts, this has destroyed the fishing resources on the Indian side. The fishing resource has depleted in India's exclusive economic zone. So as a result, Tamil Nadu fishermen are crossing over the maritime boundary line and they are trying to fish in Sri Lanka's economic zone. This is nothing but poaching. This is prohibited under international law. According to UN clause, resources present in the EEZ belongs only to that country. Indian fishermen cannot enter Sri Lanka's EEZ and fish. That is poaching. It is internationally prohibited. This is the core of the problem. Indian fishermen, Tamil Nadu fishermen have exhausted the resources on the Indian side due to overfishing and exploitative fishing. Now they cross the maritime boundary line. They go into Sri Lanka's EEZ to catch the fish. This obviously results in a conflict. Is that clear? The Indian fishermen will be targeted either by Sri Lankan fishermen. They run into a conflict with the Sri Lankan fishermen. Right? This results in clashes as well. Or they could be arrested or even attacked by Sri Lankan security forces, by Sri Lanka's Coast Guard, and by the Sri Lankan Navy. This has been an issue since 1980s. The issue has always remained, especially when the civil war was raging, when LTT terrorists were also using the route. Refugees and LTT terrorists were traveling through this route. The Sri Lankan Navy was on high alert. Right? Plus Sri Lanka had a problem with India. It wanted revenge against India. It blamed India for the entire civil war. So whenever Indian fishermen crossed over, they would deliberately use massive force against Indian fishermen. They would either arrest them and detain them in Sri Lankan jails for years together. They wouldn't return them, or they would use force. They would beat them up, leading to injuries, destroy the boat, and sometimes open fire as well. And many Indian fishermen have been killed. Many Tamil Nadu fishermen have been arrested, injured, and killed as well as a result of this dispute. Sometimes Sri Lanka has done it deliberately to build pressure on India, because if Tamil Nadu fishermen are arrested or hurt or if they are killed, it triggers a massive political protest in Tamil Nadu. It's a very sensitive political issue. In Tamil Nadu, it triggers a huge uproar that brings pressure, political pressure on the government of India. This has been Sri Lanka's tactic as well to trigger unrest in Tamil Nadu for supporting the Tamil cause and for putting pressure on India by exerting political pressure. So this has become an unresolved issue. The issue persists because of a related boundary issue over Kachativu Island. You can see the Kachativu Island here. It's a very important strategic island located between Rameshwaram and the Jaffna Peninsula. Kachativu actually belonged to India. Before the Maritime Boundary Agreement was signed, Kachativu was actually Indian territory. Alright? But historically, Kachativu has been important for both Tamil Nadu fishermen and Sri Lankan fishermen. If you go back to colonial times, if you go back a few decades, few centuries, Kachativu has a lot of historical, cultural, and economic significance. Fishermen from both the sides have been using Kachativu to rest, to dry the nets. And there's also a very important church and a sacred fest which is held every year, which is very important for Christians from both the sides, from Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu. For Tamil Christians, the church is very sacred. They participate in this annual fest and both the fishermen have used the island for many, many years. But when the maritime boundary line was worked out, India agreed to lease or gift or give away this island to Sri Lanka. The then Indira Gandhi government, when we struck the maritime boundary agreement, is that clear? Kachativu was given to Sri Lanka by India. The Indian government signed this agreement and gave Kachativu to Sri Lanka. So since then, Tamil Nadu fishermen have lost access to Kachativu. They have very limited access to Kachativu. Historically, they have been crossing over, so they don't respect the maritime boundary line, and also it's not easy to figure out where exactly is the boundary line, because these are open waters. It's not like there's a physical boundary demarcating where is the border. So fishermen cross over, sometimes deliberately, sometimes accidentally, and it triggers a major dispute between the two countries. Right? To resolve this, we had set up a joint working group in 2004. It came out with some recommendations, but still the issue has not been resolved. All right? Unless we solve the problem of bottom trawling and exploitative fishing, this problem is likely to continue. I'm stressing on this topic because it's very important. In the last 1 year, these incidents have happened again. Few Tamil Nadu fishermen were shot. They were killed as well in the last 1.5 years. The issue has been triggered again. So that is why the topic is relevant. You should know what the fishermen dispute is all about. All right? So India on its part has tried implementing some solutions with the state government of Tamil Nadu. We have spread awareness. We have discouraged bottom trawling. In fact, state governments had banned Persian fishing. It's a current affairs topic. State governments like Tamil Nadu and others had banned Persian fishing, but later the Supreme Court has intervened, the government of India also supported, and Persian fishing has been resumed. Since Persian fishing is important for fishermen, it's been allowed to continue. But in general, we are discouraging bottom trawling and Persian fishing. Plus the Navy, the Indian Coast Guard, the Ministry of Shipping and the Ministry of Fisheries, and of course the state government and the state departments. They're all working together to ensure that our fishermen don't cross into Sri Lankan waters. We are using technology as well for this purpose. Today, all fishing vessels have to be registered in India. Every boat, every vessel has to be registered. They're given unique IDs. They're given a unique registration number. They're fitted with GPS equipment and transponders to figure out their location. Right? They have been given communication equipment as well. So by these measures, we are trying to spread more awareness among the fishermen to educate them that not to cross into Sri Lankan waters. All right? The Indian Navy, Coast Guard, the Tamil Nadu state authorities, they're all working together to make the fishermen more aware of the dangers of crossing into Sri Lankan waters. But however, the issue is unresolved. We still don't have a final solution. It keeps happening every now and then. Because physically, it's impossible for India or Sri Lanka to guard the maritime boundary line. It's such a large area, it's open water. You can't have troops everywhere. It's impossible. You can't have a physical barrier as well. Again, it's impossible. So the only thing which will work is technology. GPS equipment, navigation equipment will really help, and awareness. But unless and until we encourage Tamil Nadu fishermen to not cross, unless and until we create an incentive for them not to cross, this will not work. Right? That is why we need to tackle the issue of bottom trawling and Persian fishing. We need to regenerate the fishing resources on the Indian side, which has been depleted. Right? So that is a major concern here, and hence the issue persists even today. Understood? Next. Now I would like to talk about the India-China competition and conflict in the Indian Ocean, and what measures has India been taking to counter the Chinese influence. Till now, we were just talking about the rising Chinese influence. So let's look at the other side as well. Let's understand the security relations that India is building with Sri Lanka and other Indian Ocean countries. Let's look at some important initiatives India has taken to firmly establish Indian influence in the Indian Ocean and counter the rising Chinese influence. We should also talk about some important groupings, some regional groupings. India is leading these regional initiatives. We have important defense and security arrangements with Sri Lanka, Maldives, and others. So you should be aware of this. What measures have we taken diplomatically, and what defense and security measures have we taken to protect our interests, to tackle all the threats in the Indian Ocean. We should also talk about the projects, the Indian and Chinese projects in Sri Lanka. That helps you understand the competition between the two countries for influence in Sri Lanka. As we know, Sri Lanka is located in a vital strategic location. This makes Sri Lanka very important for any country. Its location is what makes it so important for both India and China. So India's biggest concern here is the rising presence of China. As I explained, China's diplomatic, economic, and military influence has grown significantly in the last 15 to 20 years. Especially when the Rajapaksa brothers were in power, they allowed PLA Navy to dock their ships and submarines, including nuclear submarines. China has made very big investments, taken up big projects, and exercises a lot of diplomatic influence in Sri Lanka and across the Indian Ocean region. But India is not far behind. India is right in this competition because we are the traditional power. India has always been the dominant power in the Indian Ocean, and we retain that influence even today. We are countering the Chinese influence through our own measures. For example, we are supporting and leading some regional groupings. There are some important regional groupings backed by India, which gives us a platform to exert Indian influence. One such grouping is IORA. Another initiative is IONS. And the third initiative is the Colombo Security Conclave. Please write this down, make a note. There are three important regional initiatives, security-oriented initiatives. There is a grouping called IORA, which is led by India. There is a military initiative called IONS, again led by India. And another security platform called Colombo Security Conclave. These three platforms give India a unique position in the Indian Ocean. The IORA is a very, very important regional organization that represents the Indian Ocean. It was previously called IORARC. This is the old name of the group. Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation. Just like we have SAARC for South Asia, IORARC was set up for Indian Ocean in late 1990s. It was established in late 1990s. It was an initiative led by India, Mauritius, and South Africa. These three countries led the establishment of this group called IORARC. This is the old name of the group, Indian Ocean Rim Association for Regional Cooperation. It basically brings together the rim countries or the littoral countries of the Indian Ocean. What do you mean by this? I hope you studied this in geography. Rim countries or littoral countries are those countries which are part of the Indian Ocean, which open towards the Indian Ocean, like Iran, for example, Pakistan, India, Australia, South Africa, Kenya, right? Thailand, Myanmar, of course, Bangladesh, then Singapore, Indonesia. All these are your rim littoral countries of the Indian Ocean. The countries which share the Indian Ocean, which have a coastline towards the Indian Ocean, they are the rim countries. They form the rim of the Indian Ocean, right? They're called the littoral states. This group brings together most of the important littoral states of the Indian Ocean. Later, it was renamed as IORA. Today, it's called IORA. The name has been changed to make it simpler. Today, it stands for Indian Ocean Rim Association. It's a simpler name. Previously, it was called IORARC. This group is led by India, It is headquartered in Mauritius at Port Louis. It's headquartered in Mauritius. And today, the group has more than 20 member countries. You need not remember all the members, you need not by heart them, but you should have a rough idea. All right, so take this as a small exercise from my side, small assignment. Read about the members of IORA, which countries are part of it. I've already given some names: India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, there's Iran, United Arab Emirates, right? UAE is also part of Indian Ocean. Then Oman, Tanzania, South Africa, Kenya, Mozambique, there's Australia, you have Seychelles, there's Southeast Asian countries as well, like Indonesia, Singapore, and the others. So all the littorals are part of it. There are more than 20 countries in this group. So please take this as a small assignment, a small exercise. Read about the members. Just identify who are the member countries. You need not by heart all the countries, just be familiar with the major ones. This group is focused on many issues of the Indian Ocean. All right, it focuses on, IORA focuses on promoting economic relations. For example, it promotes the blue economy model. Yesterday, I explained what is blue economy or ocean economy. Through IORA, India is promoting the blue economy model for all the Indian Ocean countries. It focuses on maritime security because, as I explained yesterday, there are many security threats in the Indian Ocean. There are terror groups operating in the Indian Ocean. Piracy is a common threat. There are organized criminal groups involved in drug smuggling and arms smuggling. Plus, radicalism has increased. There are a lot of extremist groups operating across the Indian Ocean. So they represent a common threat to all the countries. So maritime security is a major priority. Next, they focus on cultural relations as well, because all these countries, they're linked by the Indian Ocean. Since historical times, there has been a trade and cultural exchange between them. They focus on disaster management and provide HADR assistance to each other. This is another priority because Indian Ocean is hit by disasters. It's hit by cyclones, tsunamis, etc. And climate change, rising sea levels is a concern. So the big countries like India, Australia, etc., they help the smaller countries in disaster management. We provide HADR support. We also focus on climate change, on other aspects of cooperation such as education, healthcare, etc. These are priority areas of IORA grouping. And India leads the initiative, and thus we project our influence, our diplomatic influence across Indian Ocean. Such platforms can help in projecting our influence, the lead role that India plays. This group has become so prominent that even outside powers are seeking entry into it. All right. For example, France is a member. France is a member of IORA. Why? Because France is present in Indian Ocean. Don't be surprised. Don't be shocked. France is a European country, but France has a territory in the Indian Ocean. It's called La Réunion, the French Reunion. It's a small French territory near Africa, near Madagascar, right? Near Mauritius and Madagascar. This is a French territory which France has retained since colonial times. So France is a member of IORA, which is a very close friend of India as well. Other countries like US, UK, China, Russia, and Japan, even they are very, very interested in this group because they all have a presence in the Indian Ocean. UK has an island, the Diego Garcia Island, which is a British Indian Ocean territory. I'll show that island in the map. I'll come to it later. This British territory, or BIOT, it's a British Indian Ocean territory. It's called the Diego Garcia Island. It's located to the south of Maldives. This is a British colony. Britain has retained it. It's a British island even today. This has been leased to the US after the Second World War. And here US has set up a major naval base, a military base. Remember I told you in 1971, when US threatened India, when it dispatched the 7th Naval Fleet to threaten India, the naval fleet came from here, from the Diego Garcia naval base in the Indian Ocean. Right? So the US has a major military presence in the Indian Ocean. This is where US runs all its major military operations across the Indian Ocean. Japan and Russia are also participants here, even China. They all have a naval presence, a military presence across the Indian Ocean, mainly to tackle piracy and to establish their influence. So they have all been seeking membership. Some of them are observers as well to IORA grouping. Some of these countries have been added as observers to IORA. That is the importance of this organization. So take a small exercise, as I told you, read about the members and observers. All right? Just spend 2 minutes, go through the member countries and the observer states. That is more than enough. I've covered the rest. Through this platform, we are projecting our diplomatic influence. Another important Indian initiative is IONS, Indian Ocean Naval Symposium. This is led by the Indian Navy. Indian Navy organizes this symposium. It's a conference. It is usually organized once in 2 years. It's a biennial event. All right? We bring the navies of Indian Ocean together under this initiative. Several top navies of Indian Ocean are brought together under this conference to discuss all the security issues and the areas of cooperation as far as maritime security is concerned. IONS is an initiative between the navies. It is different from IORA. IORA is a grouping. It's a regional organization which has its own secretariat. All right? IORA focuses on many areas including maritime security. But IONS is a naval initiative. IORA is between the governments. All the governments are participating here. But IONS is only between the respective navies. It's led by the Indian Navy. It's a conference where they come together to discuss the security issues and identify areas of cooperation to promote maritime security in the Indian Ocean. Recently, Indian Navy has proposed a military exercise involving IONS navies. IONS could even lead to a full-fledged military exercise, which will again establish the predominant influence of the Indian Navy across Indian Ocean. All right? And finally, we had a trilateral security arrangement, a trilateral maritime security arrangement that was signed in 2011 between India, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. Under this maritime security arrangement, we have been helping Sri Lanka and Maldives in their maritime security. We have been giving them defense equipment. We have been assisting them in maritime surveillance, maritime reconnaissance, directly giving them support and training to deal with all the security threats. India's vision was to expand this security initiative to include Mauritius as well. We really wanted to include Mauritius under this initiative. And after many years of effort, India has succeeded. India has succeeded in transforming this trilateral security initiative into the Colombo Security Conclave that was established last year. It was formally set up last year. It brings together India, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Mauritius. These are the members of Colombo Security Conclave. It brings together their respective national security advisors, armed forces, and intelligence agencies to form a security-based initiative focused on the Indian Ocean. These are the member countries. Along with the members, other countries of the region, Bangladesh, Myanmar, and Seychelles, they've all shown a lot of interest and they are brought as observers to the Colombo Security Conclave. Bangladesh and Seychelles have already been admitted as observers. They participated in last year's Colombo Security Conclave. Even Myanmar is very eager. Myanmar is very eager to join the security initiative as an observer. But because of the crisis in Myanmar, the proposal is on hold. It is yet to join. But Bangladesh and Seychelles have joined as observers. They might even become full-time members. There's a proposal to make Bangladesh and Seychelles full-time members of this grouping, which is a security grouping. It is entirely focused on military cooperation and intelligence and security cooperation between these Indian Ocean countries. It allows the NSAs to come together. National security advisors will meet, discuss all security issues. It will bring the armed forces, the Navy, Air Force, the armies of all these countries, and the intelligence agencies together to cooperate to deal with all security challenges. This firmly establishes India's military influence in the Indian Ocean. All right. So these are three important initiatives we have taken. One is the IORA grouping, which is a regional organization. Second is IONS, a naval symposium led by the Indian Navy, which brings all navies to cooperate and collaborate together. And the Colombo Security Conclave with few countries, that is Sri Lanka, Maldives, Mauritius, Bangladesh, Seychelles, and others. All right. So this is an example to show how India is countering China, how India is strengthening its diplomatic and military influence. Now let's talk about the economic investments of both the countries. What kind of economic competition do we see here? What kind of economic influence has China exerted, and where does India stand? See, Sri Lanka has agreed to join the Belt and Road Initiative of China. It's very much a part of the Maritime Silk Road, the 21st century Maritime Silk Road of the Belt and Road Initiative, or the One Belt, One Road project. Remember, I told you that all the neighbors of India have joined the Belt and Road Initiative of China, except for Bhutan. Other than Bhutan, all the neighbors of India, they have joined Belt and Road Initiative. So Sri Lanka being an island country in the Indian Ocean, it's an integral component of the 21st century Maritime Silk Road that China is creating under its Belt and Road Initiative. So China has mainly focused on some important strategic projects, and India also has its own set of investments in Sri Lanka. This is where we witness a competition, a strategic conflict. China has developed the strategic Colombo port. The most important port in the region is Colombo port. China has developed this. It's built the Lotus Tower in Colombo, which is a TV broadcasting tower. It's also for recreation and tourism. It's a very tall tower in Colombo that attracts tourists. All right, and it's a TV broadcasting tower. So such projects have been set up by China. China has also built roads, few railway lines and power lines. It is looking to set up special economic zones as well. So China does have great influence. It has invested in many key projects. The biggest of all projects has to be the Hambantota port project that you see here in southern Sri Lanka, and the Matala airport right next to Hambantota port. These projects were actually offered to India. Many years ago, India was offered to develop the Hambantota port. All right, India even considered the proposal. We conducted an initial evaluation, but the Indian study showed that Hambantota port is not viable. It's not going to be financially viable because Sri Lanka already has so many ports. A small country already has the Colombo port with world-class infrastructure. It has another port here in eastern Sri Lanka called the Trincomalee port, which has been vital since the British era. The Trincomalee port is extremely important since the British times. Then there is the Kanke Senturai port here in Jaffna. So Sri Lanka had enough port facilities, and India felt there was no need for another port. Even if you build this, even though it's a strategic location in the southern Sri Lankan region, right, it would give a predominant influence in the Indian Ocean. It wouldn't serve an economic purpose according to India because it wouldn't generate revenue. The project would fail. That was India's assessment. So India did not take up the project. India didn't get involved in Hambantota port project. Later, the same project was handed over to China. China was very eager to develop Hambantota port and Matala airport. All right, China gave a massive loan. Of course, China does not do charity here. It was a huge loan taken by Sri Lanka to build and execute the project. Chinese companies built Hambantota port and Matala airport and handed it over to Sri Lanka. But as India had predicted, both the projects failed spectacularly. Hambantota port is a failure. It's a loss-making port. Matala airport has become the world's most silent airport. From many, many years, not a single aircraft has taken off from Matala airport. Both the projects have failed commercially, just like India had predicted, thus leading to questions as to why China invested in the projects in the first place. This brings us to a strategy of China, which has been labeled as debt trap diplomacy. It's a term coined by Western governments and Western think tanks and Western media. India also believes that China has this strategy called debt trap diplomacy. According to this strategy, China looks out for strategic locations and it finances so-called commercial projects. It will finance the construction of these commercial projects, such as building a port or an airport, etc. Initially, it appears that it's a commercial project, having a commercial motive. But it is believed that China deliberately invests in such projects which are likely to fail. If the project fails, what will happen? These small countries, they will fall into a debt trap, into a debt burden. Small countries in Asia, in Africa, small island countries, they get attracted by such concessional loans because they will be struggling for investments, right? They won't be able to create infrastructure on their own. So these small countries, they get attracted by Chinese loans because it appears to be a concessional loan. So they accept the funds willingly, right? They get attracted by it. They execute these projects, get the port and airport, etc. built, and eventually when the project fails, when it doesn't generate enough revenue, these small countries, they are not able to repay the loan. Thus, they fall into the debt burden and the debt trap of China, and this exposes China's real intention. China's real intention was never the commercial project. It was the strategic location of the project. It has been noticed that China will take over these projects for a long-term lease, thus potentially giving itself a strategic port facility in faraway locations. Hambantota port, for example, it failed. Sri Lanka could not repay the loan, and as a result, a Chinese company has won the contract. A Chinese company has been given a 99-year lease. A Chinese company has been given a 99-year lease over Hambantota port. So this Chinese company will operate the port for 99 years, for a century. Now the fear is, right now it's still a commercial project, still used for commercial purposes. But if required, it could easily become a military base for the PLA Navy. If China is deploying its ships and submarines and vessels into the Indian Ocean, if they require logistical support, right? If they require logistical support, their naval ships submarines, and even spy vessels. They can dock at these ports controlled by Chinese companies. This is the fear. The fear is that China is deliberately investing in such commercial projects which are likely to fail. It is designed for failure. That will push the small country into a debt trap, into a debt burden. It will be forced to give away the project to a Chinese company. Chinese company will gain a long-term lease. And as China controls these key projects, it could give it a strategic angle. If required, it could turn a commercial facility into a military facility and give support to Chinese ships and submarines, which poses a serious security threat in the Indian Ocean. This is the fear of India and the Western countries. India and Western countries believe that this is a deliberate Chinese strategy. It's called the debt trap diplomacy of China. All right, Sri Lanka has fallen prey to this. Hambantota port has failed, Matala airport has failed, and a Chinese company has got a long-term 99-year lease over Hambantota port. These fears have come true for India because recently when the Chinese spy ship came, the Yongwang 5, it docked at Hambantota and Colombo despite India's protests. China can do this because it has leverage on Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka has borrowed heavily from China. Chinese companies control Hambantota port and Colombo port, and this is a strategic threat for India. Is that clear? So these are some major Chinese projects. India also has countered Chinese investments. We have our own set of projects going on. We have rebuilt some important infrastructure in northern Sri Lanka, in the Jaffna region. We have focused our investments mainly in the Tamil provinces, in the northern and eastern provinces. This is the focus for India. We have rebuilt the Kanke Senturai port, the northern railway track, and the Palale airport. All of them are located in the northern province, in the Jaffna region. These key projects were destroyed by the civil war and by the tsunami. Since this was a stronghold of LTTE, during the civil war, the Kanke Senturai port, the Palale airport, and the northern railway track had been damaged. Then came the 2004 tsunami, which destroyed these projects. Right? So India has rebuilt all these important infrastructure and connectivity projects. We have reconstructed the Kanke Senturai port, rebuilt the Palale airport and northern railway track. After the civil war ended, post 2009, after LTTE was defeated and wiped out, we built 50,000 houses in northern Sri Lanka under the Northern Housing Project. More than 50,000 houses have been built by India to rehabilitate the Tamil IDPs, or internally displaced people. Because of the war, Tamil civilians were displaced internally. Inside Sri Lanka, they became internal refugees. These internal refugees are called IDPs, internally displaced people. So they have been accommodated in these houses built by India. We have built more than 50,000 houses under the Northern Housing Project. All right, these are some of the previous projects of India. But recently, from 2015 to 2019, when we had a friendly government under Maitripala Sirisena, India actually won some important projects that established our influence. But shockingly, these projects were taken away. Most of these projects were cancelled by the Rajapaksa brothers after they came back to power. After they came back to power in 2019, they tried to cancel and derail Indian projects. Is that clear? But because of the economic crisis, as the Sri Lankan economy collapsed, Rajapaksa government needed India's help. They took a lot of assistance from India. They asked for India's assistance, and in return, they have awarded these projects back to India. All right, I'll show you which are these projects. I'll talk about them. It's important for your prelims. When we had a friendly government from 2015 to 2019, we had won some important projects. India had been awarded some key projects. We were very eager to take them up because that would counter the Chinese influence. But when Rajapaksa brothers came back to power in 2019, they tried to cancel them, they tried to derail them. All right, but after the economic crisis started from 2020 onwards, Rajapaksa government started asking India for help and assistance. They knew India will not help if the projects are not given back to India. So because of the $4 billion assistance we have given, a lot of projects were awarded back to India. So let's see which are these projects. See, near Colombo port, there are important terminals. The East Container Terminal is a critical project that has been proposed. It was supposed to be built by India and Japan as a collaborative project under Asia-Africa Growth Corridor Initiative. Asia-Africa Growth Corridor is a joint project of India and Japan to create infrastructure, connectivity infrastructure all across Asia and Africa. This is a counter of India and Japan to China's Belt and Road Initiative. If China has Belt and Road Initiative, through which it is building connectivity infrastructure across Asia and Africa, it is believed that India and Japan are trying to counter the Belt and Road Initiative through their Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. All right? So India and Japan together were looking to develop East Container Terminal, and this project had been awarded to India and Japan. But after Rajapaksa brothers came to power, they cancelled the project. There were some local protests. Some locals, they protested against Indian and Japanese involvement. They protested that foreign countries shouldn't develop these key projects. They should be developed by Sri Lankan government. Based on these protests, Rajapaksa brothers cancelled the project and took it away from India and Japan. But India had reasons to believe that these protests were triggered deliberately by China and Rajapaksa government. These were most likely sponsored protests so that it could be used as an excuse to cancel the project and to remove India-Japan from the East Container Terminal. Because shockingly, the same project was later awarded to a Chinese company. China has won the contract to develop East Container Terminal thanks to Rajapaksa government. All right. Later, when Rajapaksa brothers came to India begging for help and assistance, they tried to please India. And they offered another project, the West Container Terminal. Right near Colombo port, there are two important terminals which are coming up: East Container Terminal and West Container Terminal. India and Japan were supposed to develop East Container Terminal, but China took over because of the protest. The project was cancelled, and clearly China had influenced the Rajapaksa government. So to please India, to push India to give economic support to Sri Lanka, Rajapaksa government tried to please India, and it awarded the West Container Terminal project to India's Adani ports. Adani Group won the key project to develop West Container Terminal at Colombo port. Along with this, India had won a contract to develop and rebuild the oil tank farms at Trincomalee port. See, Trincomalee is vital for energy supplies in the region. There are oil tank farms built here at Trincomalee port. These are British-era oil tank farms, which stores oil in large quantities. It is important for energy supplies in the region. During the World War period, the British had built these oil tank farms. Even today, we use these oil tank farms. India also is involved here. We supply oil to these tank farms, right? India, Sri Lanka together are managing some of these oil tank farms. But they're very old. They're getting rusted. They're outdated. So India had proposed to rebuild the oil tank farms at Trincomalee port, which was a strategic project for India. All right. And near Trincomalee, there is a place called Sampur, here in eastern Sri Lanka, where we proposed a thermal power plant. The Sampur thermal power plant was supposed to be built by NTPC, National Thermal Power Corporation of India. These projects had actually been awarded by the friendly government, by Maithripala Sirisena government. The oil tank farm project at Trincomalee and the thermal plant project at Sampur had been awarded to India. But Rajapaksa government tried to delay this. They tried to derail these projects. But after facing the economic crisis, they came to India for help, and then these projects were awarded back to India. As of now, India has got the contract back to develop oil tank farms at Trincomalee and the thermal plant at Sampur. And the last point here, when Rajapaksa brothers came back to power, they awarded solar and wind projects to a Chinese company near the Park Bay region, to the north of Jaffna Peninsula, that's between Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka. In this important location, Rajapaksa government awarded green projects, solar and wind energy projects to a Chinese company. This was in 2020, 2021. India protested against this, saying you cannot allow Chinese companies here because it's a security threat. The projects will be just few kilometers away from India's coastline, from Tamil Nadu. It would come up in the Park Bay region. So India protested against the project, but Rajapaksa government wouldn't listen to India. But after facing the economic crisis, after asking India for help, these projects were taken away from China and it has been awarded again to Adani Group. India has won the project to develop solar and wind energy projects between Jaffna and Tamil Nadu in the maritime borders between India and Sri Lanka. Solar and wind projects are likely to come up, which will be built by Adani Group. Previously, it was given to China, a Chinese company. But after Sri Lanka depended on India for economic assistance, these projects have been given to an Indian company. This is the level of competition that we face here with China. There is intense competition, right? Both countries have big investments. China has become very influential, there's no doubt, but India is not far behind. We are having our own projects going on, our own investments. We have done this for many decades, in fact, right? And we have used all the groupings that we discussed to promote our diplomatic, economic, and military influence. And we are also focusing on strengthening our cultural relations. We are mainly focused on Buddhist diplomacy. Buddhist diplomacy is the pillar of our cultural relations. Is that clear? We even provide scholarships and training to Sri Lankan students and citizens under ITEC program and the Colombo Plan. Colombo Plan was adopted way back in 1950s. It provides for education-related funding. It provides for educational scholarships. So through ITEC, the Indian Technical Economic Cooperation Program, and Colombo Plan, we provide scholarships to Sri Lankan students. And under the Buddhist Circuit initiative, Sri Lanka is a top focus for us. Under the Buddhist Circuit we are creating, right, where we are improving infrastructure at Buddhist sites. Sri Lankan pilgrims and tourists are the primary focus. For example, recently in Uttar Pradesh, we inaugurated an international airport at Kushinagar, which is a sacred Buddhist site. While inaugurating this airport, Sri Lankan leaders, Rajapaksa family, were all invited for the inauguration. Sri Lankan leaders were the chief guests while inaugurating the Kushinagar airport, because the airport is meant for Buddhist pilgrims. It is part of the Buddhist Circuit initiative. All right. Another example is we transported Kapila Vastu relics and displayed it in Colombo, so Sri Lankans could pay respect to the Kapila Vastu relics. This is believed to be the bone and ash fragments of Lord Buddha. It's believed that the bone and ash fragments of Lord Buddha is preserved in Kapila Vastu relics. Kapila Vastu is a historical old city which doesn't exist today. It's actually in Nepal. It's supposed to be in Nepal. It's never been found. So from here there is a relic which originates. It's like a vase in which there is ash and bone fragments. It's believed to be of Lord Buddha himself. So this is widely worshipped in Buddhism, and currently it is with India. India owns the Kapila Vastu relics. We transported the relics and displayed it in Colombo for a few days, so that Sri Lankan pilgrims can pay their respects. They need not come to India, right? We took the relics itself. The vase was transported by the Indian High Commission. We held an exhibition, and lakhs of Sri Lankan Buddhists not come to India, right? We took the relics itself. The vase was transported by the Indian High Commission. We held an exhibition, and lakhs of Sri Lankan Buddhists, they came and paid respects to the Kapila Vastu relics. So that is one way of boosting our cultural relations. Buddhist diplomacy is the focus here, and Sri Lanka is very much part of the Buddhist Circuit initiative. All right. So this completes all the aspects of India-Sri Lanka relations. The civil war, the background, India's involvement, right? We spoke about the military and diplomatic relations, the maritime security aspect of the relationship, the competition from China, what measures has India taken to counter the Chinese influence, and of course the cultural relations. If you understand this, it's more than enough. And of course, we have covered the economic aspect as well, including the latest economic crisis. All right, this is more than sufficient. It's a big chapter, but it's still a very, very important topic. As far as Indian Ocean is concerned, Sri Lanka is a major country, a very important neighbor of India. All right, so now let me take all your questions, all your doubts, and then we can start with the other half of the Indian Ocean. We'll look at Maldives. We'll try to get an introduction to Maldives. These are actually smaller topics compared to the other bigger chapters. We'll try to start with this and we can resume it in the next class. First, let me take all your questions, clear all the doubts on Sri Lanka. Anand is asking from where they procured airplanes, which airport did they use? I think Anand is referring to LTTE. See, there are many arms traffickers. All right, there are many criminal groups. They supply arms and weapons, and it's not so difficult to procure a small civilian aircraft or even a small helicopter. There are many private companies which would sell. So through criminal cartels, LTTE had procured few small aircrafts, and since they controlled large parts of northern provinces and eastern provinces, they had created small strips, airstrips. They had created these small airstrips where the small planes can land and take off. So LTTE had procured aerial capabilities back then. Pooja is asking, is LTTE a UN designated terror group? Yes, it's a globally designated terror organization. Even US and Western countries have declared LTTE as a terror outfit. Moina is asking, how can it harm when submarines are present in the oceans? How is it a threat to our country? See, it means Chinese submarines can easily reach close to Indian waters. It's a threat being issued to India. It means PLA Navy can reach Indian waters any point of time. If the Chinese Navy has access to Colombo and Hambantota, right, they can deploy their submarines, their ships, bringing them right next to India's coastline. And in case of a conflict, in case of hostilities, China will have an edge over the Indian Navy. So that is how it's a threat. It's a long-term strategic threat. Akhil is asking why Tamil Nadu and West Bengal's interests are not seen as India's interests, despite them being important states of India. See, usually regional interests are narrow. Regional interests are focused only on the region. The interests of Tamil Nadu, interests of West Bengal are specific to the region. But sometimes national interests are bigger. National interests can be the opposite of regional interests. What West Bengal wants, what Tamil Nadu wants, may not be what India wants. For India, it was important to have good relations with Bangladesh. For India, it is important to sign the Teesta Agreement. The government of India was ready, but because of political pressure and electoral politics, political parties have stayed away from signing the Teesta Agreement. We saw how the land boundary agreement was derailed. by coalition partners and opposition parties. Because of regional politics, domestic politics, and coalition politics, our ties were compromised with Bangladesh. India's interest would be better served if we had signed and executed the Teesta Agreement and Land Boundary Agreement, right? So we couldn't do that, and it affected our ties with Bangladesh. Same with Sri Lanka. India's interest was in helping the Sri Lankan government, helping Rajapaksa to defeat LTT. LTT was always a threat to India. It would have brought us close to Rajapaksa, given us control over Sri Lankan government, and we could have countered the Chinese influence more effectively. But we couldn't do it because of pressure from Tamil Nadu. Because Tamil Nadu interests were different. It was inclined towards the Tamil population, towards even extending some support to LTT, which India could never do, right? So that is why our interests were compromised. So sometimes regional interests are narrower compared to national interests. National interests acquire significance. But when there is a conflict, sometimes your regional interest can derail your foreign policy. Swasini is asking, when did China acquire Hambantota port? It was in early 2000, somewhere around 2004, 2005 is when China got the Hambantota port project. Soumya Shri is asking, if Rajapaksa is pro-China, why would ISIS attack Sri Lanka? See, it's because the radical Sinhala Buddhists, they have not only targeted Tamil minorities, of late they have been targeting Muslim minorities as well. In Sri Lanka, there is a minority Muslim population, especially in eastern Sri Lanka. And the Muslim minorities have been targeted by the right-wing extremists, by the radical Buddhist extremists. This has created a communal divide. And some of the victims of this violence have taken up radicalism. They have been radicalized. And they have set up a terror group called NTJ, National Tawheed Jamaat. Some of these radical Muslims who suffered from the violence from the radical Buddhists, they have founded a terror group called NTJ, National Tawheed Jamaat. This is a Sri Lanka-based terror group. It has links with India as well. NTJ has connections in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. This group has pledged loyalty to Islamic State. It's influenced by ISIS ideology. So when it carried out the Easter Sunday bombings, it gave the credit to Islamic State. And ISIS acknowledged it, which shows that some link, some connection exists between ISIS, the parent ISIS in Iraq and Syria, and the NTJ in Sri Lanka. Ashutosh is asking, please explain the currency swap arrangement again. See, in a currency swap arrangement, the central banks of two countries, they exchange currencies. For example, if Sri Lanka is facing a crisis, it wants immediately $500 million in USD, in US dollars. It has some immediate payments to make. So Sri Lanka does not have the dollars. Its forex reserves have depleted. So then, what Sri Lanka can do, Sri Lanka can ask India's RBI, please give us 500 USD today. As a guarantee, I'll give you the equivalent of Sri Lankan rupees. I'll deposit 500 million worth of Sri Lankan rupees with RBI and take 500 USD in return. You're swapping the currency. Now, RBI, which has enough forex reserves, will give the US dollars to Sri Lanka and it will hold the Sri Lankan currency as a guarantee. So Sri Lanka will use the US dollars to make its payments, immediate payments will be fulfilled. And at a later date, after a few months, maybe 1 or 2 years later, Sri Lanka will take it back. It will take back its own currency by repaying the dollars to India, to India's RBI. So that is a currency swap arrangement. Kipriya is asking, why are non-rim countries of Indian Ocean part of IORA as dialogue partners? It's because they are very interested in the Indian Ocean. I've explained in previous classes. Indian Ocean is the focus point. It's the main focal point of global geopolitics today. It's part of the Indo-Pacific. Even external powers which are not part of Indian Ocean are very interested in IORA. I already mentioned that point if you paid attention. Ankur is asking, what's the role of observers? What benefits do they get? See, observers can participate in the meetings. They can observe. They can contribute to the discussion, but they cannot vote. Observers will not have voting powers, and observers cannot set the agenda. They can't propose a new initiative. They can't come up with a new resolution. All right, and they can't vote as well. They can simply participate, discuss, debate, and take notes. So that is the role of an observer. Next, Dangal is asking, sir, why headquarters of IORA is in Mauritius? It's because Mauritius was one of the countries which led the initiative, in the establishment of the initiative. How is the group headquarters decided? Through consensus. Countries will discuss between them and they'll finalize one location. Shivani has a similar question on the function of observers. As I told you, they can't vote. They can only participate, discuss, debate, but they can't set the agenda. They can't become the chair of the group. They can't bring up resolutions. They only participate in the discussions. Aditya is asking, sir, how culture of soft power helps to strengthen relations with other countries? We already discussed this in previous classes, right? So in the last 2 weeks, that's what I've been insisting. Soft power relations are very important. It helps in building a good image, a positive image, in creating trust with the other country. Misbah is asking, does LTT exist today? See, LTT is a dormant group. It's like your Khalistan groups. LTT has been wiped out. It's no longer in operation, right? In the last 14 years, since 2009, it does not operate anymore. But of course, remnants will be there. Former LTT members, they would have fled. There are some hiding in Sri Lanka itself, some in India. Some have fled to Southeast Asia, Australia, and Europe. So there's every possibility of LTT also getting revived someday in the future. Attempts have been made to revive LTT. So it's a dormant group. It's not completely dead. It's not active as well. It's a dormant group like your Khalistan outfits. You can see that of late, attempts are being made to revive Khalistan terror groups. So it was a dormant terror movement, and now attempts are being made in the last 10, 12 years to revive the movement. Okay, so these are the questions. Now let's come back to our discussion. We'll start with the few remaining countries of Indian Ocean. We'll look at Maldives, Mauritius, Seychelles, and part of East Africa. This is a priority region for India, a focus point for India. And I want you to revise the priorities that I had highlighted for India in the Indian Ocean. Right? Yesterday, I spoke about the Sagar Doctrine. I explained what the Sagar Doctrine is, how India is trying to guarantee security and growth for all in the region, and how India aspires to become the next security provider. We are also promoting the blue economy model for creating the right economic opportunities across Indian Ocean. So in the Indian Ocean, our main focus is to retain our strategic influence, to retain our traditional influence, to protect our diplomatic interests, our economic interests, and security interests. This is what India prioritizes in the Indian Ocean. So that's why we have to work with all these countries very closely. Even the small countries cannot be neglected. See, Mauritius is a very small country. Maldives is a very small country. Seychelles is a very small island. And yet, they are extremely important in our foreign policy. All right? If you look at India and Maldives, we share a very special relationship, a very unique relationship. Historically, Maldives has been very close to India. And Maldives, being a small nation, it faces a lot of challenges. And India has always been helping Maldives. All right? So let's examine the background of this relationship. Let's look at the diplomatic relations that have developed between the two. Let me help you understand the unique locations, the geography of Maldives as well. And that should be enough for today. Tomorrow we can resume and we can complete this chapter entirely. See, as far as Maldives is concerned, the country has seen some phases of political instability. All right. So ensuring political stability is the top focus of India. It occupies a key location. There are hundreds of islands of Maldives that are spread across Indian Ocean. This is an important sea lane for trade, for shipping. There are plenty of resources present here, plenty of threats present as well, security threats. So our focus here is to ensure the stability and the security of this important region. India has very big interest in Maldives. We want to ensure political stability in the country and protect maritime security of this country. There are many Indians working here. All right, Indian nationals work here in quite large numbers. Indian companies have big investments. As you know, Maldives is known for its tourist potential, right? It's a beautiful set of islands, a set of atolls that are spread across Indian Ocean. You have hundreds and hundreds of luxury resorts, which is widely popular around the world. From India, from China, from around the world, from Europe, US, and Russia. A lot of tourists, millions of tourists come to Maldives every year. It's the biggest source of revenue for Maldives. So Indian hotels, India's hospitality sector has big investments here. Many big Indian brands have major facilities. They've invested a lot of money. There are many Indians working as well. So we need to protect those investments. We have many threats and many concerns, but thankfully, Maldives has usually been very, very friendly to India. All right. So let's examine this relationship further in detail by looking at the location of Maldives. If you observe this map, you will notice that Maldives is located over here. It stretches in a north-south direction, and it's not one contiguous country. It has a very unique geography. It is made up of these hundreds of islands. The dots that you see here, that is Maldives for you. You can't even represent it properly on a map. These islands are so small. Maldives is essentially an archipelago of islands. All right, it's called an atoll state because it is made up of atolls. These islands, they are atolls. Basically, atolls are these geographical formations upon coral structures. Coral structures, they form on these underwater ridges. That becomes the land, that becomes the territory. See, in this stretch here, okay, this is Mauritius here. This is the French territory I was talking about. All right, this is Mauritius. Right next to it, you have the French Reunion, La Reunion, which is the French territory. Here you can see the British Indian Ocean territory. That is Diogo Garcia. It's a British territory given to US. So this is where the US naval base is located, the south of Maldives. So over here, you have the Chagos group of islands. Somewhere over here, that actually belongs to Mauritius, but is occupied by Britain even today. Britain has not given up some of the islands here, including Diogo Garcia. Diogo Garcia has been leased to US. US has set up a military base. Next to Diogo Garcia, there are a few other group of islands which are still under British control. So this is a dispute between Mauritius and Britain at the UN. The Chagos dispute has been taken to the UN by Mauritius. Mauritius has sovereignty, it is claiming sovereignty. It wants to claim Chagos region and Diogo Garcia as well. It's supposed to be Mauritius territory. But Britain and US are not allowing this to happen because they have a major military base over here. They don't want to give up their strategic military base in the Indian Ocean. All right? So it's an ongoing UN dispute, a dispute at the United Nations, where Mauritius is seeking control of Chagos and Diogo Garcia. I'm highlighting this because all these points are relevant for your prelims. From Chagos, there is an underwater ridge. There is an underwater mountain structure that comes towards the Lakshadweep Islands of India. This is called the Chagos Lakshadweep Ridge. It's an underwater mountain stretching from Chagos to Lakshadweep of India. All right? On these mountain structures, on the top of these mountain structures, coral reefs would have formed, and they barely come up above the water surface, and this becomes the land. So such territories are called atolls. Such islands are called atoll islands or atoll states. So there are these underwater mountain structures like Chagos Lakshadweep Ridge running in this direction from Chagos to Lakshadweep of India. So on the top of these mountains, coral structures will form around it, thus giving rise to a small land, a small island, which is an atoll. And when hundreds of such atolls come together, it becomes an archipelago. Archipelago is nothing but a collection of islands. Hundreds of small islands together collectively are called an archipelago, a group of islands. So Maldives is one such country. It's not a contiguous country. It does not have a large geography of its own. It's made up of these small islands with their atolls basically. It's a very small land formation sitting on the top of these mountain structures. It's made up of coral structures entirely. All right? There are hundreds of such islands stretching from Lakshadweep. The northernmost island of Maldives is near Lakshadweep. We actually have a maritime border here. All right? India and Maldives share a maritime border. Our exclusive economic zone is adjacent to each other. All right? So the northernmost island is near Lakshadweep Islands of India. From here, it stretches thousands of kilometers south, even crosses the equator. Maldives is present both in northern and southern hemisphere. The southernmost island is in the southern hemisphere, closer to Diogo Garcia. So it's such a widespread country. All right? Now the advantage of having such atolls is that these atolls are naturally beautiful. They have a great recreational value, great tourist potential, and this is a big source of revenue for Maldives. Since many decades, tourism has been the biggest revenue for Maldives. All right? By having so many atolls spread out, you'll also get a large exclusive economic zone with enough resources, with fisheries, possible hydrocarbon reserves and minerals. So this is another blessing of being such an island state. However, it also has many drawbacks. There are many serious drawbacks for such countries. Their economy is not diversified. Because see, such countries have very minimal resources, right? They don't even have proper land. The population is extremely less, and they just can't rely only on tourism and marine resources. That is not going to last forever. If there's a crisis, let's say the pandemic, when travel restrictions came, tourism came to a halt. If tourism stops, the country's economy will collapse, right? So when you don't have a well-diversified economy, your economy is always at risk. So countries like Maldives, they frequently face an economic crisis. They face a liquidity crisis, a foreign exchange crisis. They won't be able to balance their payments. The BOP account, the balance of payments will witness a frequent crisis in such countries because the economy is not well diversified. They're dependent too much on some sectors, on few sectors. Next, the other concern is essential items like water, agriculture, food items, food commodities, fuel. They will not have any of these resources. Maldives doesn't have enough fresh water. There are no rivers or big lakes. It depends on desalination. Imagine the whole country being dependent almost on desalination. It has very, very limited freshwater resources. It can't grow crops. There's no agriculture, right? So most food items are imported. It has very basic, very minimal local agriculture. And fuel supplies, again, has to come from outside. So essentials are not present in such countries and they become dependent. This is another drawback. All right. Next, they are vulnerable to security threats. What if a terror group or criminal group or pirates, what if they capture an entire island? Because many of these islands are uninhabited. There are so many islands here. Some are populated. There are resorts everywhere, but some islands are still uninhabited. What if a terrorist group or a pirate group or criminal group capture an island and turn them into their base? It becomes a major security threat. These small countries, They are weak in defense. They don't have enough resources to build strong armed forces to protect their islands and their exclusive economic zone. So they face a challenge in defending themselves. So defense becomes a challenge. Carrying out patrolling, surveillance, countering the threats becomes a challenge for the small countries. And the other bigger threat is climate change. The rising sea levels can easily submerge such islands. Global warming has led to rising sea levels, and it is feared that countries like Maldives will get submerged. Many islands will get submerged because these are low-lying atolls, right? They're at a very low sea level, and they can easily get submerged even if there's a small rise in sea level. They face the biggest risk of extinction because of climate change. These are the biggest concerns. See, security concerns exist here because this region is affected by terrorism, crime, and piracy. Look at here. Look at this part of region of Africa. This is Horn of Africa. All right. This is Horn of Africa. This is the Gulf of Aden. The Gulf of Aden, this region here. I've already told you this is Bab el Mandeb Strait, which is a choke point. Right. So here in Horn of Africa, there are many terror groups that operate across Horn of Africa and East Africa. There are many terror outfits that have a presence. Understood? In Somalia, for example, there's a terror group called Al-Shabaab. Here in Somalia has been going through a civil war since 30 years. A radical terror group called Al-Shabaab has taken control. This group is aligned with Al-Qaeda. It has links with Islamic State as well. In East Africa, Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have a presence. For example, in Kenya, in Tanzania, and especially in Mozambique. In these East African countries, terrorism has been a concern. There are many jihadist outfits like Al-Shabaab and local branches of Al-Qaeda and Islamic State. They pose the biggest risk, the biggest security threat. Is that clear? And it is Al-Shabaab of Somalia which supports piracy here. These are the piracy-infested waters. You can see the pirate attacks represented here in this map. Near Mauritius, near Seychelles and Maldives, and near Horn of Africa. In between this region, piracy is very rampant. It is Al-Shabaab of Somalia which supports the Somalian pirates to attack the ships, to hold them hostage, to get a ransom. This ransom is their revenue. This is how Al-Shabaab has been funding its terror operations. All right? So piracy is a major threat in the region. And the region is a hub of organized crime. Drug trafficking and arms smuggling is a major risk in this part of the Indian Ocean. These criminal activities are linked with Afghanistan and Pakistan. There are connections with Iran, connections with West Asia, connections with Africa and Indian Ocean and South Asia. So organized crime is very prevalent here. So a terrorist group like, let's say, Al-Shabaab or Somalian pirates, or groups affiliated with Al-Qaeda or ISIS, or a remnant of a Tamil militant group, right? Any of these groups could capture an island and create a major security threat. So these are some challenges faced by countries like Maldives. Economically, they are vulnerable. Even from security and defense point of view, they face a number of risks and threats. Plus, there is the risk of climate change. Is that clear? So that is why countries like Maldives become very dependent, and Maldives is very, very dependent on India. India has been the supporter of Maldives in every possible domain. This close relationship was established back in 1965 itself, when Maldives became independent. As soon as Maldives gained independence, close diplomatic relations were set up. We actually have historical links as well, dating back to several centuries. Muslim traders who were trading between the Gulf, West Asia, India, and Southeast Asia. These Muslim traders formed a common link. They would come from the Persian Gulf, from the West Asia region. They would trade in India, in Kerala, in Karnataka, Tamil Nadu, etc., and link with Southeast Asia. They have often been a common link, establishing a historical cultural influence with Maldives. This is during medieval times. Then you have various Indian empires like Cholas, Pallavas, etc. They did have influence in Maldives as well. All right. Today, Maldives is a Sunni country. It's a majority Sunni country. It's a Muslim country. But the country has always been peaceful, moderate for most of its history. It had never fallen under radicalism, at least until 2012. All right. It was a moderate, peaceful, stable country. It was a Sunni majority country. We resolved our maritime boundary back in 1976 through peaceful talks. And we have helped Maldives in every possible way. We have even signed a trade agreement to support Maldives, since it sources most of the supplies from India. Fuel, then construction equipment, medicines, food items, everything is sourced from India. So Maldives will have a big trade deficit, right? And it's not sustainable for a country like Maldives. So to help Maldives import from India, we have a trade agreement. We provide free trade, duty-free access. We work together through the SAFTA, the South Asia Free Trade Agreement, under the SAARC grouping, to South Asian Economic Union, to such South Asian platforms